Welcome to Viking-Age Scandinavia, where the landscape doesn't merely challenge you, it files a formal complaint against your existence every morning. Before we dive into winters that act like they own the place or seas that toss ships around like laundry, we start with the foundation, the land itself. Because if you ever wondered why Vikings seemed permanently annoyed, overly practical, and ready to leave home at the drop of a helmet, the answer is simple. Look outside. Nature wasn't just harsh here. It behaved like an irritated landlord who wanted its deposit back. Before we venture into the wild, unforgiving landscapes of Viking-Age Scandinavia, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what the world outside looks like where you are right now. Now let's begin. The Scandinavia in the Viking Age was a massive stretch of dramatic, glacially carved terrain. Fjords sliced into the coastline like nature's attempt at modern design. Mountains rose like impassable stone walls, and forests sprawled endlessly in every direction. This was not a landscape built for convenience or hospitality. This was a landscape built to test your relationship with oxygen. Every valley, every ridge, every twisted coastline reminded people that living here was less a lifestyle choice and more an act of stubbornness passed down through generations. Picture your arrival. No roads, no flat plains stretching into the horizon, no gentle rivers bubbling invitingly. Instead, you're standing in front of a landmass that looks like the gods dropped rocks from the sky out of boredom. To the west, jagged mountains tower over you like disapproving giants. To the east, ancient forests whisper, creak, or grow ominously quiet. Never a good sign when you can't see more than a few steps past the tree line. And everywhere you look, the wind runs full speed across the terrain, slapping you in the face as if to say, "Wrong neighborhood, oh friend." Let's talk about that wind. It didn't matter whether it came off the sea or rolled down a mountainside. It always showed up uninvited and usually carrying ice somewhere in its pockets. The wind in Scandinavia had the personality of a disgruntled warrior, loud, cold, and constantly reminding you that comfort was for people who lived elsewhere. When Vikings built houses, they weren't trying for beauty, they were building fortifications against the air. And if the wind didn't get you, the terrain would. Scandinavia didn't believe in flatland. The idea that ground could simply stay at one level was apparently too boring for the north. Instead, the landscape looked like the gods took a smooth sheet of earth and kneaded it aggressively before anyone could stop them. Hills rose in unpredictable mounds. Cliffs dropped away without warning. Valleys appeared exactly where you wished they wouldn't. Walking anywhere required the agility of a mountain goat and the optimism of someone who didn't mind falling. Even the coastline refused to be helpful. Rather than stretch along in a tidy line, it splintered into countless fjords, deep, narrow inlets that sliced into the land like nature had been practicing its sword skills. These fjords were beautiful, yes, but only in the sense that deadly things often are. Their towering walls and immense depth meant that living near the sea provided food, but also ensured you were constantly hovering between "this is stunning" and "this is how people die." Isolation was another uninvited roommate in Viking life. Geography didn't just separate communities, it hid them. One farmstead might be tucked into a valley so steep that winter sunlight lasted approximately 5 minutes. Another might cling to a cliffside like it was holding on for emotional support. Travelling between settlements took time, strength, and an emotional resilience equal to the task of crossing a continent. In many places, if you stood on a ridge and shouted for help, only the wind would answer, and it would sound annoyed about it. But here's the part that really explains Viking psychology. Despite all this, people stayed. Not because they were trapped, though geography certainly tried its best, but because they adapted. The land shaped them into people who understood hardship not as a crisis, but as a daily inconvenience. Need to move through a mountain pass? You learn. Need to harvest food from stubborn soil? You learn. Need to navigate a coastline shaped like a broken puzzle? You learn. Scandinavia offered no shortcuts, so Vikings became experts at making the long route work. This rugged environment forged a culture that valued strength because the land required it, valued community because isolation was deadly, and valued preparation because the environment often refused to give warnings. If other civilizations grew from fertile plains and predictable seasons, Scandinavian culture grew from a place where even the ground seemed suspicious of your intentions. And that's why Vikings didn't simply live here. They endured it. They learned to read the landscape like a book written by an author who disliked plot structure. They built homes deep into the earth to stand against storms, raised livestock that could survive temperatures normally reserved for punishment, and carved communities into a world that seemed determined to erase them. So yes, you didn't settle Scandinavia. You survived Scandinavia, and this was only the introduction. The land itself was the first challenge, the baseline, the opening threat quietly waiting behind every ridge. The good news, you made it this far. The bad news, nature hasn't even begun to get creative yet. If you thought Scandinavia's geography was unfriendly, wait until you meet its winter, an entity less like a season and more like a hostile takeover. Winter didn't simply show up on the calendar. It marched in fully armed, barricaded the doors, confiscated your optimism, and informed you that sunlight was now a luxury item. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, winter wasn't a backdrop. It was the loudest character in the story, the one everyone feared, respected, and tried desperately not to provoke. To understand the Viking psyche, you must picture winter not as 4 chilly months, but as a 6 to 8 month occupation. It arrived early, stayed late, and behaved like it was paying rent. Temperatures plunged so low they felt like a personal attack. The cold was everywhere, in your bones, in your house, in your mood. Even the air had weight. Taking a breath felt like inhaling a disappointed sigh from nature. Food that had been gathered or hunted during the warmer months didn't simply run low. It disappeared at alarming speed. Winter forced Vikings into a strategic mindset that bordered on militaristic. You didn't prepare, you stockpiled, rationed, and prayed that your math was correct. A miscalculation wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Imagine sitting around a fire in January, counting your dried fish like they were gold bars, while outside the wind screamed obscenities through the cracks in your walls. And then there was the darkness. Not soft, cozy, romantic winter twilight, no. Viking winter darkness had ambition, weeks of dim light, days where the sun barely skimmed the horizon, as if embarrassed to be seen, nights that stretched endlessly, or allowing every creak of your house to sound like a supernatural invoice for your sins. Winter daylight didn't brighten the world, it merely kept it visible enough to navigate the misery. This darkness didn't just affect visibility, it affected sanity. Imagine waking up and thinking it's still midnight, only to discover it's noon. Imagine working, eating, repairing tools, checking on livestock, all in a world dimmer than a poorly lit tavern. The constant shadow made people jumpy, introspective, and extremely protective of fire. Without flame, darkness simply won, and the cold? It wasn't a casual chill, it was an intelligent adversary. Winter cold sought out weaknesses, an unpatched wall, a loose thatch panel, a boot worn a little too thin, fingers that worked too slowly tying a knot. Tools froze, doors froze. Water froze so solid you could mistake your bucket for a decorative sculpture. Even the ground turned into a stone floor that offered no forgiveness to joints, hooves, or morale. Livestock suffered too. Sheep grew coats thick enough to qualify as small ecosystems. Cows needed constant monitoring just to ensure they didn't become large frozen statues that mooed internally. Pigs stayed inside more than the humans did. The entire farm functioned like a war camp, every member of the household 2-legged or 4 trying to outlast the season. But the true terror of winter was its resource freeze, literally and figuratively. Rivers locked up under sheets of ice thick enough to support a small army. Lakes became giant slabs of frozen refusal. Streams that once provided fresh water turned into glassy sculptures you couldn't drink from unless you had an axe, patience, and a strong sense of irony. Nature had pressed pause on every natural resource. Nothing grew, nothing replenished, nothing forgave. Firewood became the new currency. A household's winter wealth wasn't measured in silver, it was measured in stacked logs. The sound of someone splitting wood wasn't background noise, it was survival jazz. Every log was a small extension of your life expectancy. Too few logs, you were negotiating with hypothermia. Inside the longhouse, life was cramped, loud and smoky. Winter forced everyone into a shared human stew. Family, servants, animals, tools, everything in one elongated room. Privacy ceased to exist. Personal space was a myth. Even your thoughts had to wait their turn. But this closeness wasn't optional, it was tactical. Body heat mattered. Every person was a small furnace that contributed to the collective attempt to not freeze mid-conversation. Yet despite its cruelty, winter wasn't purely an antagonist, it was a sculptor. It carved discipline into Viking culture. It demanded foresight, planning, cooperation and respect. Winter taught you that nature wasn't simply something to observe, it was something to survive. This was not a world where you could procrastinate. If you said, "I'll fix that leak tomorrow," winter's answer was, "No, you won't." And this is what shaped Viking resilience. You don't become a sea raider, explorer, or poet warrior by lounging through mild winters. You become one by experiencing 6 months of annual environmental bullying and thinking, maybe Iceland would actually be nicer. So winter didn't merely arrive, it moved in, rearranged the furniture, and dared anyone to object. The good news, you learned to endure it. The bad news, winter did not care about your progress and would happily test you again next year. If you want to understand why Viking-Age Scandinavian saw the world as a place full of unpredictable gods and lurking dangers, all you have to do is look at their winter sky, or rather, the alarming absence of it. Darkness in the north was not a gentle early nightfall type of experience. It was a full-scale disappearance of the sun, a vanishing act so dramatic it felt intentional. In other lands, the sun dipped below the horizon. Here it packed a bag, muttered something about being tired of this relationship, and left for weeks. Imagine living in a world where the sun rises late, hesitates at the horizon as if second-guessing its life choices, and then retreats before you even finish your chores. Some days the daylight wasn't short, it was symbolic. A faint glow that offered no warmth, no guidance, and absolutely no reassurance that the sky remembered how to function. You didn't experience daytime, you glimpsed it. This loss of light did far more than make it hard to see. It unravelled the very rhythm of life. Human beings are not built for continuous twilight. We like schedules. We like waking up in the morning and saying, "Ah yes, this is daytime." In Viking Scandinavia, you woke up, stared into darkness and asked, "Is it midnight? Or breakfast? Or both?" Time was less a sequence and more a suggestion, and without sunlight to anchor the day, your internal sense of reality got flexible. Long, unbroken nights were notorious for blurring thoughts, bending moods, and amplifying fears. A simple noise outside didn't sound like wind brushing against the house, it sounded like something with a name. A creak in the rafters wasn't the wood adjusting, it was an omen. When you can't see, your imagination clocks in for overtime. People responded to the darkness in all sorts of psychological ways. Some grew restless, pacing the longhouse like caged wolves. Others grew heavy and lethargic, sinking into a quiet numbness. Children asked questions adults didn't want to answer, like why the sun didn't love them enough to stay. Sleep patterns became a shimmering hallucination of naps, accidental naps, and, whoops, did we sleep through what little daylight we had? And then there was the cold, which paired beautifully with the dark to create a mental cocktail of dread. Imagine lighting a lamp just to check the expression of someone sitting across the room, and realizing they look just as exhausted, confused and slightly haunted as you do. Darkness doesn't just hide things, it changes them. The human mind fills in the blanks, and in Viking-Age Scandinavia the blanks were enormous. To cope, people developed rituals, routines, and comforting superstitions. Some believed certain lamps kept evil spirits away. Others avoided staring into the windows at night because their reflections blurred into shapes nobody wanted to interpret too deeply. Families told stories to keep spirits up. Not pleasant fairy tales, but sagas filled with heroes who had the common sense to fear the dark as much as everyone else. Even daily tasks took on the tone of mild madness. Eating meals at the wrong hour became normal. Working by lamplight became necessary. People sat by the fire, which was usually the only light source, and watched shadows dance on the walls, sometimes too gracefully for comfort. Conversations drifted, slowed, and often ended with someone muttering, "We'll know what time it is when it gets brighter," which was an optimistic lie everyone accepted. And it wasn't just the absence of light, it was the emotional weight of that absence. Darkness pressed on you, settled into your bones, and wrapped itself around your mind like a heavy wool cloak you didn't ask to wear. You weren't simply tired, you were winter tired, darkness tired, a special form of exhaustion usually reserved for people on long voyages or parents of newborns. Yet remarkably, Vikings adapted. They understood that without light, they needed each other. Darkness created an intense form of communal living. You didn't wander off alone unless you wanted to become a cautionary tale. You relied on shared warmth, shared tasks, shared stories, and shared sanity. Isolation in constant darkness wasn't brave, it was foolish. Still, there was no escaping the truth. This was a land where the sun simply gave up for a while. When daylight finally did appear, even briefly, people reacted with reverence bordering on worship. Adults paused work to stare. Children pointed like the sky had just performed a magic trick. The return of the sun wasn't just a shift in weather. It was a spiritual event, a reminder that the universe hadn't forgotten them. This extreme cycle of losing and regaining the sun shaped not just daily life, but cultural imagination. It fueled myths of giant wolves chasing the sun and moon, gods wrestling with cosmic forces, and worlds that could end in darkness. If your environment regularly turned the lights off for weeks, you too might conclude that something otherworldly was involved. So yes, the sun didn't set, it abandoned you. And in that abandonment, Vikings learned endurance, creativity, and the art of remaining calm while nature played with their circadian rhythms like a bored deity. The good news, light did return eventually. The bad news, every year it left again, without warning, without apology, and without any intention of shortening its vacation. The cold in Viking-Age Scandinavia wasn't simply a temperature, it was a living force with a personality, and that personality was quietly vindictive. Unlike storms or wild animals, the cold didn't roar, charge, or threaten. It crept, it seeped, it waited. It was an assassin disguised as weather, a patient adversary who knew it didn't need to rush because eventually everyone stepped outside, and stepping outside was not optional. Vikings had work to do, animals to tend, wood to gather, water to break free from its frozen casing, and the cold treated every one of these tasks as an opportunity. It wasn't looking for a dramatic showdown, it preferred efficiency. Vikings didn't freeze in some heroic tableau. They froze by degrees, slowly, subtly, sometimes without even realizing what was happening, until their fingers stopped following instructions and their thoughts wandered off like confused sheep. Hypothermia in this world wasn't a medical term. It was a neighbour, always lurking at the edge of the longhouse, waiting for a moment of carelessness. Maybe you stepped outside without enough layers. Maybe you stayed out too long. Maybe the wind, sly as ever, found a gap in your clothing. The cold worked with the cunning of a seasoned hunter. It didn't need strength, only opportunity. The earliest signs were small: a numb fingertip, a sluggish blink, a breath that seemed to freeze before you finished exhaling. Vikings didn't have the luxury of ignoring these signs, because turning back a little too late was the kind of mistake nature happily turned into a cautionary story. Fingers stiffened first, becoming clumsy tools that struggled to grip an axe handle. Then toes lost feeling. Then legs lost coordination. The cold dismantled you like a craftsman taking apart a machine piece by piece, until you were a person-shaped statue running entirely on stubbornness. Clothing helped, but clothing had limits. Wool could insulate, fur could shield, but nothing could outsmart the cold forever. Moisture was a particular traitor. If your clothes got even slightly damp, sweat, snow, melted ice, the cold took it as an engraved invitation. Wet wool turned into a heat-stealing thief pressed against your skin. Snow slipping into your boots. That was the cold's opening move. Foot wraps that weren't replaced fast enough. The cold applauded your mistake. And then there was wind chill, cold's highly efficient accomplice. If the cold itself was a lurking predator, wind was the one that shoved you into its jaws. Wind stole warmth aggressively, stripping layers of heat from exposed skin like a pickpocket working a festival crowd. Even strong men wrapped in cloaks felt their strength siphon away the longer they stood outside. Vikings learned quickly that bravery had no value here. Efficiency mattered. Speed mattered. Getting back inside before your nose turned into an interesting shade of purple mattered. Inside the longhouse wasn't exactly paradise either. While the fire kept the interior from becoming a human freezer, every entrance and exit meant the cold rushed inside like an overeager guest. Vikings patched walls, stuffed gaps, hung animal skins as windbreaks, and arranged beds as far from drafts as possible. But the cold still found ways in, a crack here, a loose board there, the door lifted at the wrong angle. Even indoors, the cold had opinions about how comfortable you should be. Nighttime was especially dangerous. While families slept beneath layers of blankets, cloaks, and animal skins, the fire burned low. If it dimmed too much, the temperature dropped silently. A sleeper might drift deeper into slumber while their body temperature slipped downward. A betrayal happening inch by inch. You didn't wake up shivering, you woke up when someone else noticed you weren't moving much at all. Cold also affected the mind. As body temperature dropped, thoughts slowed, sense dulled, and the world took on a dreamlike quality. An effect as dangerous as it was deceptive. Someone experiencing exposure might step outside just for a moment, thinking they felt strangely warm, unaware this was the body's final misfiring protest. The cold didn't merely steal your heat, it stole your judgment. But exposure wasn't reserved for travellers or hunters caught in the wrong place. It happened to anyone who underestimated the cold for even a few minutes. Fetching water, mending a fence, retrieving something left outside, every task required calculation. How long will this take? Became less a question and more a survival equation. The cold punished optimism. The Vikings developed strategies, of course. They layered clothing with obsessive detail. They shared body heat. They kept fires fed as though feeding a sacred beast. They memorized the signs of someone getting too cold, because saving a life often depended on noticing the subtle shift between uncomfortable and in danger. But even skill and vigilance had limits. Cold didn't respect experience. It treated everyone with equal indifference. And this constant threat shaped Viking identity more than any weapon or ship. The harshness of the cold forged a culture that respected the environment not out of politeness, but out of necessity. It taught people to prepare, observe, react quickly, and never ever assume the world was on their side. In the end, the cold didn't need theatrics. It didn't roar or strike or chase, it whispered. It waited. And if you weren't careful, you didn't freeze dramatically, you just stopped working. If the cold was a silent killer and the darkness a psychological prankster, then the forests of Viking-Age Scandinavia were something else entirely. A living labyrinth with opinions about you. These weren't the tidy, welcoming forests you see on postcards. These were vast, ancient, and unsettlingly quiet, except when they weren't quiet at all. To the Vikings, the forest wasn't scenery. It was a presence. It had moods. It held secrets. And it absolutely noticed when you walked into it. Scandinavian forests stretched for miles, unbroken and untamed. Trees grew so densely that the sun, on the rare occasions it bothered to show up, struggled to force its light through the canopy. The forest floor was a patchwork of roots, moss, hidden holes, and underbrush that grabbed your legs like mischievous spirits. Everything smelled of earth, dampness, and the faint, uncomfortable awareness that you were outnumbered. Once inside, paths disappeared instantly. A step too far, a turn too casually taken, and suddenly nothing around you looked familiar. Everything looked the same, which is to say, everything looked like a collection of trees that could swallow you whole without warning. Landmarks, forget it. Trees don't like being distinctive. They prefer anonymity when conspiring. And the silence, Vikings knew noisy danger. They respected loud threats, a raider shouting. Clear problem. A wolf growling? Excellent. Now you know where it is. But the forest didn't give you that courtesy. Many times the only sound you heard was your own breathing, and the eerie impression that something else was breathing too. Not near you, not far away, somewhere. Now and then that silence cracked. A branch snapped, leaves rustled, something moved with deliberate slowness or alarming speed, and you never got the satisfaction of seeing what caused it. Forest animals were experts at hiding. Lynx moved like ghosts wrapped in fur. Wolverines, small but terrifying, seemed to teleport. Moose, huge enough to qualify as walking towers, could stand absolutely still and stare at you with all the intensity of a judge waiting for your confession. And wolves? Let's just say the forest was their home turf. Vikings respected wolves for the same reason they respected the sea. Both could attack without warning, and neither cared about your personal schedule. A single wolf wasn't the problem. It was the pack you didn't hear. The one that circled or the one that saw you long before you saw them. In the forest, predators rarely announced their presence. They watched, they waited, they decided. But predators weren't the only danger. Getting lost was almost a sport, except the prize was panic. Once the forest swallowed you, your sense of direction dissolved. Trees misled you by looking identical. Moss grew on every side if you weren't paying attention. Even the air felt different once you realized you had no idea where home was. The Vikings told stories about spirits and creatures that deliberately misled travelers. Huldras, trolls, beings who lived in the deep woods and used the forest like camouflage. Whether or not you believed in them, the forest made belief very easy. When the world goes silent and shadows shift on their own, a few supernatural explanations suddenly seem extremely reasonable. But the forest also toyed with perception. Sounds stretched. Distances lied. A clearing that looked 10 steps away turned out to be 50. A hill that seemed manageable from afar transformed into a slippery, root-covered tangle once you reached it. Even experienced woodsmen could find themselves walking in circles, passing the same tree 3 times and questioning whether the tree was moving or they were losing their grip on reality. Weather inside the forest added its own flavour of menace. Rain didn't fall gently, it dropped in sheets that turned paths into mud pits. Fog slithered in like a creeping beast, erasing shapes and swallowing direction. The air grew thick and cold, and every shadow became a question mark. In fog, even your own footsteps sounded suspicious. To survive, Vikings treated the forest with deep respect. They learned its patterns. They noted where certain trees grew, how the terrain sloped, where water collected. They travelled in groups whenever possible, not because they feared animals, but because they feared disappearing into the maze alone. They marked routes, memorized landmarks, and relied on experience passed down through generations. Yet even with this knowledge, nobody casually strolled into the woods. That would be like casually stepping into a negotiation with a predator that had all the leverage. Children were taught early, the forest is not your friend, it is not your playground, it is not impressed by your bravery. If you hear something strange, you do not wander toward it. If you think you see a path, you do not assume it was meant for you, and if you feel like the trees are watching, they probably are. What makes the Viking forest truly frightening is that they weren't malicious. They didn't need to be. Their danger was natural, built into their size, density, and silence. You could survive the ocean if you were skilled. You could survive winter if you were disciplined. But the forest, it required humility. The forest didn't kill through grand spectacle. It killed through missteps, bad luck, and the simple human tendency to assume you were paying attention when you absolutely weren't. So yes, the trees didn't help. They observed. They stood still, ancient and patient, watching as humans tiptoed between danger and awe. The Vikings survived these forests because they never underestimated them. The good news? If you respected the woods, they would usually let you go home. The bad news? They never promised they'd help you find the way. The mountains of Viking-Age Scandinavia weren't majestic, let's paint this mountains. They were enormous, jagged walls of rock that seemed specifically designed to make travel difficult, settlement inconvenient, and survival a matter of careful negotiation with gravity. These weren't landscapes you admired, they were landscapes you respected out of self-preservation, much like a notoriously bad-tempered relative you didn't want to offend. From the moment you approached them, the mountains made their intentions clear. Steep cliffs rose like frozen waves, sharp ridges cut the sky into aggressive angles, and narrow passes dared you to test your balance. If forests made you feel watched, mountains made you feel insignificant, tiny, laughably mortal. Elevation was only part of the problem. Viking-Age mountains were made of rough stone, loose gravel, and deceptive ledges that pretended to be solid before crumbling under your foot like they had been waiting for the opportunity. Climbing wasn't an activity, it was an argument with nature, one you usually lost. Even experienced climbers moved with caution, testing each foothold like they were negotiating with a particularly petty deity. And falling? Falling was common. Not the dramatic, heroic tumbling you see in sagas or movies, just the quiet, sudden, humiliating slip that reminded you that gravity had opinions, and those opinions were almost never positive. One misstep and you could slide down a scree slope faster than you could shout a prayer, ending up bruised, scraped, or severely regretting your life choices. The mountains were not a place for pride. Even standing still wasn't always safe. Rocks shifted, snow cracked, ice loosened. The ground here behaved like it had unresolved emotional issues, rearranging itself unpredictably. Settlements avoided high elevations for this reason alone. Why build a home where the land rearranges itself with the enthusiasm of a bored sculptor? Then there were the avalanches, one of the few natural dangers that had the courtesy to announce themselves, though usually not in time to do anything about it. Snow piled up quietly for days or weeks, forming massive blankets of ice and powder that waited for the slightest excuse to come crashing down the mountainside. A loud noise, a sudden shift in temperature, a too confident goat, anything could trigger it. To a Viking standing below, an avalanche was not merely frightening, it was an unstoppable force that erased paths, crushed trees, destroyed shelters, and sometimes buried entire groups. The sound of one was unforgettable, a low rumble that grew into a roar, shaking the earth as thousands of tons of snow and debris thundered downward. If winter felt like a siege, the mountains were the artillery. But avalanches weren't the only ambush the mountains held. Rock slides were equally fond of dramatic entrances. All it took was a thaw, a rainstorm, or even a careless footstep to send boulders clattering down slopes with the chaotic enthusiasm of runaway cattle. The Vikings learned quickly that you didn't linger near steep faces, and you certainly didn't trust a large rock perched above you, no matter how balanced it looked. Isolation was another issue. Mountains carved the land into disconnected pockets, separating farms, villages, and families. A settlement in a valley could be only a few miles away from its neighbours and still feel like a journey meant only for the brave or the very stubborn. If someone fell ill, needed help, or encountered danger, assistance wasn't a quick walk away, it was often a day's trek over uneven ground, dangerous ridges, and narrow paths that barely felt wide enough to accommodate a human, much less a traveller carrying supplies. And the weather at high elevation? It changed faster than a chieftain's mood. Sunshine could turn to snow in minutes. A gentle breeze could become a howling wind that clawed at clothing and skin. Clouds hugged the peaks, obscuring visibility until even experienced travellers felt like they were walking through a world made of shifting grey. Fog wasn't a delicate mist, it was a physical barrier, a cold blanket that swallowed paths and landmarks with complete indifference. Animals didn't make the mountains any easier. Mountain goats might navigate the cliffs with smug confidence, but humans had no such gifts. Predators liked high, isolated areas too. Lynx, wolverines, and even bears wandered through these elevations, particularly when food was scarce. Meeting one on a narrow pass was the kind of encounter that turned into folklore, usually because someone had to tell the story afterward. Despite all this, the Vikings still traversed these mountains when necessary. They learned to move along ridges with steady patience, to cling to footholds with calm concentration, and to judge a slope's stability with instincts sharpened by experience. Mountain travel required preparation, cooperation, and zero overconfidence. The mountains tolerated no arrogance. And what did these mountains teach the Vikings? Profound understanding of limits, a reminder that nature here was not merely indifferent, but actively challenging. Mountains shaped travellers into cautious strategists. They carved communities into isolated pockets. They created a culture that respected the land not because it was beautiful, but because it had the power to end you for no particular reason. So gravity was not on your side. Neither were the cliffs, the slopes, the rocks, or the weather. The good news, if you managed to navigate the mountains, you earned a story worth telling. The bad news, the mountains always reserved the right to interrupt that story abruptly. To live in Viking-Age Scandinavia was to accept a difficult truth. The sea was both your greatest ally and your most committed enemy. It fed you, connected you, transported you, and enriched you, but it also waited patiently for the day you made a mistake. The ocean didn't need to be cruel. It had nothing to prove. All it had to do was be itself, and humans would eventually provide the tragedy. The North Sea and Baltic waters were not gentle blue postcards. They were restless, frigid, and prone to mood swings that could transform a calm morning into a catastrophe by lunchtime. Vikings were exceptional sailors not because they had a choice, but because their lives depended on understanding a body of water that seemed to resent their presence. The sea was their highway, grocery store, battlefield, and escape route, and it charged steep emotional fees. Imagine stepping into a long ship before dawn. The air is sharp enough to remind you that you're alive. The planks beneath your feet creak with quiet warning, and the coastline behind you fades into shadow as the horizon swallows the last traces of safety. The sea stretches out in front, vast, dark, breathing. Every wave feels like the rise and fall of something ancient shifting in its sleep. And beneath the surface, cold that could finish you faster than a blade. Water so deep it felt less like a place and more like a threat. If forests swallowed people silently, the sea erased them. No footprints, no echoes, just a name that people spoke for a while before moving on. Storms were the sea's favourite way to remind Vikings that confidence was a temporary condition. Weather on land might change quickly, but weather on the water changed instantly. One moment, clear sky, steady wind, rhythmic waves. The next, clouds slammed together, lightning sliced the horizon, and the wind screamed like a furious god demanding tribute. Waves didn't simply rise, they erupted. Walls of water lifted longships like toys and dropped them with the enthusiasm of a bored child. Crews clung to oars, ropes, and the sides of the ship while being thrown around by a force that had absolutely no intention of negotiating. The sea did not care how experienced you were, how brave you felt, or how many times you prayed. Its only constant was that it was always stronger, and yet Vikings sailed anyway. Longships were brilliantly designed, flexible hulls, shallow drafts, frames that could bend without breaking. But even the best ship couldn't guarantee anything. A single rogue wave could flip it. A hidden reef could shred it. A poorly timed manoeuvre could send the bow plunging into a trough so deep you'd swear the sea was trying to fold you into it. Shipwrecks were common enough that every coastal settlement had stories. Some spoke of ships caught in whirlpools that spun them into oblivion. Others told of vessels dashed against unseen rocks, breaking apart like eggshells. Many stories began with optimism, trade voyages, raiding expeditions, supply runs, and ended with wreckage washing ashore days later. Surviving a shipwreck was less about strength and more about luck. If you landed in the water, the cold was your enemy. It numbed limbs in seconds, stiffened muscles, and stole breath. You didn't swim in these waters, not for long. Even strong men, trained warriors, and seasoned sailors succumbed to the cold before they could reach land. Sometimes the sea spared a survivor, but only if it felt generous. Yet despite its cruelty, the sea fed Viking society. It offered fish in abundance, cod, herring, salmon, if you were brave enough to catch them. It connected communities that land made distant. It carried traders to new markets, warriors to new horizons, explorers to new lands. Iceland, Greenland, even the edges of North America. None of these discoveries would have happened without the sea's reluctant permission. But even on good days, the ocean demanded attention. Waves hid floating logs that could punch holes in hulls. Currents tugged ships off course. Winds changed direction without warning, turning a smooth voyage into an exhausting battle against nature's whims. A moment of inattention could send a ship drifting into dangerous shallows or out into open water with no clear return path. Navigation required instincts more than tools. Vikings watched the waves, the sky, the birds, the colour of the water, the shape of the swell. They read the sea like scholars read manuscripts. But even the most knowledgeable sailor could misinterpret a sign or miss one entirely. And then there were the stories, sea serpents that wrapped themselves around ships, kraken-like creatures lurking beneath the waves, spirits that lured sailors into storms. Were these real? Probably not. But when you're far from shore, surrounded by infinite dark water, and something brushes the underside of the ship, imagination becomes an eager collaborator. In a world where everything was dangerous, the sea was uniquely unpredictable. It demanded skill, respect, and sacrifice. It granted wealth but collected debt. It allowed Vikings to thrive, but only if they remembered just how fragile they were on its surface. The ocean provided, then collected interest. The good news, a skilled crew could ride the waves, return home, and tell their tale. The bad news? The sea kept most of the stories for itself. If there was one thing Viking-Age Scandinavians could agree on, it was this. The weather had trust issues, not minor ones, cataclysmic ones. One moment you were enjoying what passed for a pleasant day, and the next the sky transformed so abruptly you'd swear you'd offended the atmosphere personally. Storms didn't glide in with gentle warnings, they ambushed. They arrived like they'd been hiding just behind the clouds, waiting for someone to relax before shouting, "Surprise!" Forget modern weather forecasting. Vikings didn't have satellites, barometers, or polite meteorologists telling them to expect light showers. Their version of a forecast was, "The sky looks fine for now," a statement less useful than a wooden anchor. Even skilled weather readers, farmers, sailors, hunters could only guess, and nature loved proving them wrong. Imagine standing outside, perhaps repairing a roof or tending livestock. The sky is clear, the air is calm, birds are chirping. You think, maybe today won't try to kill me. And that's exactly when the weather decides to prove you dangerously optimistic. A distant grumble of thunder echoes. The wind shifts in a way you don't like. Clouds appear with unsettling speed, thick and dark, gathering like a council of storm spirits preparing a presentation on human fragility. In mere minutes, everything changes. The sky dims as if someone lowered a cosmic lantern. The temperature drops. The air feels charged, heavy, and suddenly too quiet. Even animals go still. They've seen this before and have zero interest in participating. Then, without ceremony, the storm hits. Rain doesn't fall. It hurls itself at you. Wind becomes a force capable of rearranging your limbs. Lightning spears across the sky with theatrical flair, illuminating the world in frantic, startling flashes. The helplessness of these storms was part of what made them so terrifying. You couldn't outrun them. You couldn't hide from them. A storm didn't care that you were in the middle of hauling supplies or repairing a fence or simply trying to exist. If it wanted to arrive, it arrived. And your best strategy was usually to duck, cover, and hope your roof remembered its purpose. Viking longhouses, sturdy as they were, weren't invincible. A strong enough storm could rattle walls, threaten beams, and tear roof thatching into abstract art. People would gather near the central hearth, gripping cloaks, listening to the wind scrim through gaps in the wood. Children looked to adults for reassurance, and adults looked to the ceiling and whispered promises to every god they could think of. Storms had a way of humbling even the most fearless warrior. Thunder was a spectacle all its own. It didn't just rumble, it cracked open the world. It boomed with such force that it shook tools off shelves, startled livestock into chaos, and made everyone briefly reconsider all their life decisions. It's no coincidence that Thor, the thunder god, held such a strong presence in Norse mythology. When thunder shakes your entire house regularly, you don't just explain it scientifically, you assume someone really important is up there and he is not in a good mood. For people caught outdoors, storms were more than inconvenient, they were life-threatening. Viking clothing kept you warm, but even the thickest wool couldn't fight the combination of rain, wind, and plunging temperatures. A sudden storm could soak you through, sap your strength, and turn a simple walk home into a battle against exposure. You didn't need to be far from shelter to be in trouble. You only needed to be unlucky. Travellers, especially those crossing mountain paths or open fields, were at the mercy of the weather. A clear morning could become a blinding storm by mid-afternoon. Roads washed out, visibility vanished. Landmarks disappeared into sheets of rain or swirling snow. If the storm involved sleet, the world became a slippery, miserable obstacle course designed to test your balance and your will to continue being alive. Fire was another casualty. A household's fire was its anchor, but storms threatened it. Strong drafts or leaks in the roof could extinguish a hearth flame, plunging a home into cold and panic. Restarting a fire in the middle of a storm was a frantic operation involving dry kindling, rare, steady hands, unlikely in a storm, and sheer desperation, abundant. But perhaps the most unnerving aspect of these sudden storms was their unpredictability. Just as quickly as they arrived, they left, sometimes within the hour. The clouds tore apart, the rain eased, the sky brightened, and nature acted as though nothing had happened. Birds resumed chirping, the wind relaxed. The sun reappeared, pretending innocence. The people, however, were not fooled. They knew better. Clear skies in Scandinavia weren't a comforting sight, they were a rumour, a polite suggestion, a temporary ceasefire. And everyone understood that behind that harmless little blooper sketch lurked another storm waiting for its cue. These fierce, unpredictable storms shaped a culture of preparedness. Vikings learned to always have supplies ready, always keep tools near, always know the nearest shelter. They didn't waste clear days, they used them like precious resources, aware that nature could revoke them without notice. The storms didn't rage out of malice. They simply existed, powerful and indifferent. But to humans living beneath them, they were constant reminders that control was an illusion. The good news? Storms always passed. The bad news? They always came back, and usually when you least expected them. If you lived in Viking-Age Scandinavia, you learned early that ice was the most convincing liar in nature. Snowstorms were loud, mountains were obvious. The sea was dramatic, but ice? Ice was subtle. Ice smiled at you. Ice pretended to be trustworthy. Ice looked you in the eye and said, "Of course I can hold your weight," while quietly preparing the paperwork for your watery funeral. It was nature's most deceptive mirror, glittering, beautiful, and catastrophically unreliable. In winter, lakes, rivers, and fjords froze over, turning the landscape into one continuous sheet of white and blue. To a Viking, this was both a blessing and a trap. Frozen surfaces transformed travel routes that were impassable in summer into smooth highways, straight, direct, and far faster than trudging over uneven ground. But that convenience came with a clause. You had to gamble your life every time you stepped onto the ice. Not all ice was created equal. Thick ice, the kind that groaned under your boots but held firm, was safe enough. But thin ice was the silent poet of disaster. Thin ice made no announcements. It didn't wave a warning flag. It simply waited. You couldn't always tell if the surface was solid or if it was actually a cold trap door. Snow often disguised weak patches, turning risky areas into white lies. The laws of physics were not on your side. Water currents underneath could thin ice unpredictably. Warmer springs feeding into frozen rivers created deceptive weak zones. Fjords, with their deep salt water and tidal shifts, froze unevenly no matter how convincing the surface appeared. A Viking who trusted ice without testing it was not a Viking for long. Travellers used tools and instincts to check safety, poles to tap the ice, studying cracks, listening for the pitch of the ice's song. Yes, ice sang. A deep, resonant hum meant stability. A sharp, brittle crackle meant run. But even experts misread those signals. Sometimes the ice remained silent until it decided it was tired of pretending. And when ice failed, it did so with terrifying precision. One moment you were walking, or worse, riding a sled or driving livestock, and the next the world beneath you gave way. The crack was sharp, instantaneous. The collapse happened faster than a gasp. Your stomach dropped, the surface vanished, and suddenly you were plunging into freezing black water that punched the breath out of your lungs. Cold water shock was immediate. The chest tightened, muscles seized. Even the strongest warriors lost control of their limbs. The icy water didn't simply chill, it immobilized. And then came the real terror, trying to climb back out when everything around you was crumbling into shards. Ice had no grip. Every attempt to pull yourself up broke the surface further, widening the hole and sapping precious strength. If someone nearby heard the fall, rescue was a desperate race. People crawled on their bellies to distribute weight, reaching out with poles or ropes, praying the ice didn't choose to add them to the casualty list. Every second mattered. Hypothermia didn't wait politely. Animals fared no better. Horses and cattle sometimes crashed through ice while being driven across rivers. The panicked thrashing of a full-sized animal in freezing water was a tragic chaos that could drag humans down in the attempt to save them. Vikings sometimes lost valuable livestock in these accidents, a financial blow on top of a deadly hazard. Rivers posed their own dangers. Unlike lakes, they didn't freeze evenly. Faster currents carved tunnels under ice sheets, hollowing them out like the river was secretly eating the ice from below. A surface that looked smooth and safe could actually be a fragile crust hiding rushing water. And fjords? Their salt content meant they froze late, thawed early, and generally behaved like they resented the concept of walking altogether. And then there was the issue of sound. Ice made noises. Lots of them. Loud booms echoed across fjords as the ice expanded or shifted. Cracks spiderwebbed underfoot with unnerving speed, even when the ice didn't actually fail. Some nights, frozen lakes sounded like distant thunder or muffled drums. Vikings, practical people though they were, could not entirely shake the feeling that the ice was talking to them, and its tone was rarely friendly. Despite the risks, Vikings needed the ice. Winter travel relied on it. Trade relied on it. Communication relied on it. They learned to treat frozen surfaces with respect bordering on reverence. People crossed in single file, following experienced guides. They avoided dark patches, slushy areas, and sections where the ice sagged under snow. They carried poles to test the way ahead. Many wore skis or long skates to distribute weight more evenly, and to move faster if things started to go wrong. Even with all this caution, accidents happened. Every village had stories. Someone's cousin, someone's father, someone who was just crossing the river for a moment. The ice forgave no error, no distraction, no misplaced confidence. But the greatest danger wasn't always falling through. It was assuming the ice would behave the same way tomorrow. It didn't. Ice changed daily. It thickened, thinned, cracked, heaved, shifted. You had to relearn its moods every time. Vikings joked that ice had a mind of its own, but it wasn't really a joke. So yes, the ice promised support and delivered betrayal. It looked sturdy, glittered beautifully, and invited you forward like a friendly hand. But trust it too quickly, and you discovered the truth. The ice never supported you. It merely tolerated you until it didn't. The good news, if you respected the ice, it usually let you pass. The bad news, it never once promised it would. Step outside your Viking-Age longhouse, and you're immediately reminded of something modern people often forget. Humans were not the top of the food chain. Not here, not in the deep north. Scandinavia's wilderness belonged to creatures stronger, faster, quieter, or simply hungrier than you, and they knew it. Humans weren't yet the dominant species. They were participants, candidates, occasional snacks. If you walked into the forest, across the mountains, or along the fjord edges, you entered the territory of animals that viewed humans not as threats but as curiosities. The wolves, the bears, the lynx, they didn't run when they saw you. They assessed you. They considered you. You weren't the apex predator. You were a suggestion. Let's begin with wolves, the most misunderstood colleagues in the Scandinavian food chain. Wolves travelled in packs, moved like shadows, and communicated with eerie precision. They were clever, coordinated hunters operating in landscapes where humans were slower, clumsier, and far less organised. While wolves didn't actively hunt humans were too much effort for too little reward. The line between not hunting you and you look interesting today could blur under the right circumstances. A lone traveller, especially in winter, could easily encounter a pack trailing at a distance, studying his gait, his speed, his weaknesses. Wolves didn't need to attack to terrify. Their presence alone was unnerving. A flicker of movement in the trees, soft paws on snow, glowing eyes reflecting torchlight. If one wolf was visible, more hovered just out of sight. Vikings respected wolves because wolves respected nothing except opportunity. But even wolves seemed polite compared to bears, the undisputed heavyweight champions of Viking forests. Scandinavian bears, especially brown bears, acted like they owned the place because, frankly, they did. They made decisions based on appetite, mood, and the particular way the wind blew that day. Bears could outrun humans, outclimb humans, outswim humans, and outfight humans. The Viking solution to this imbalance was simple. Do not upset the bear. Encounters were unpredictable. Bears spent a lot of time minding their own business, eating berries, turning over logs, being large. But when surprised, provoked, or hungry, they became catastrophically dangerous. A bear emerging from the brush was one of those moments when a Viking suddenly remembered he had unfinished chores back at the longhouse. And don't forget hibernation season. If you stumbled upon a winter den, the bear wasn't the only one who didn't want to be awake. Then there were lynx, the silent assassins of the north. Unlike wolves and bears, lynx didn't make noise. They didn't sniff, snarl, or growl. They appeared. They existed in the periphery of your vision, if you were lucky. A lynx moved so quietly that even experienced hunters sometimes realized one was near only after spotting its tracks, and those tracks always seemed too large, too fresh, and too close. Lynx didn't hunt humans, but they didn't fear them either. They watched from trees, they slinked between rocks, they surveyed travellers the way a cat surveys furniture, calculating whether you were interesting enough to investigate further. Their silence was their power. In a world where danger often announced itself, the lynx specialised in ambiguity. And these weren't the only animals that tested Viking patience. Wolverines, small but ferocious, behaved like they had been told they were bears and refused to believe otherwise. Moose, enormous and territorial, charged at humans with the enthusiasm of someone clearing their property line. Even boars, muscular, tusked, armoured with attitude, could turn a peaceful walk into a sprint for your life. Every creature in the north had an agenda, and none of these agendas involved making human lives easier. The important thing to remember is that Vikings weren't always armed. Hunting trips required weapons, yes, but fetching water, gathering wood, checking traps, or herding animals did not. A man carrying only an axe for firewood might meet a bear who didn't appreciate unexpected visitors. A woman gathering herbs near the forest edge might spot wolves pacing in the distance. Children playing too far from home could find themselves watched by eyes that glowed at dusk. Nighttime amplified every risk. Predators thrived in darkness, their senses sharpened, their movements blended with the shadows. A wolf pack felt invisible. A lynx perched in a tree became a rumour with claws. And a bear waking early from hibernation wandered with the confused irritation of someone disturbed from a nap. Humans, meanwhile, were half-blind and fully vulnerable. But even daylight offered no guarantees. Snow distorted sound. Fog concealed movement. Trees created blind corners. A clearing could turn into an ambush site. Vikings carried torches, shouted warnings, travelled in groups, and taught their children to respect the unseen. Yet fear remained an everyday companion, rational, justified, and occasionally life-saving. This reality shaped Viking culture profoundly. They developed stories about spirit animals, shapeshifters, and creatures who walked between worlds. Their mythology didn't come from whimsy. It came from living alongside predators who reminded them daily that survival was not guaranteed. A wolf howling at night wasn't simply a sound, it was a reminder of your place in the hierarchy. A bear passing through a village wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a negotiation between two species with overlapping territories. And so Vikings lived with caution. They listened to the forest, read tracks like scripture, watched the wind, and avoided arrogance. Humans might one day become the apex predators of the north, but not yet. In the Viking Age, they were simply one more creature trying not to get eaten. You weren't the apex predator, you were a suggestion. The good news, respectful caution usually kept you alive. The bad news, the animals had not received any memo declaring humans important. If the forests watched you, the mountains threatened you, and the predators evaluated you, then hunger did something far more intimate. It lived with you. It sat at your table. It lingered in your thoughts. It prowled just behind your ribs. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, hunger wasn't an occasional discomfort. It was a familiar shadow, a constant reminder that nature, not humans, controlled the flow of calories. Food scarcity shaped every single day. Full was a temporary state. Satisfied was suspicious. And plenty was the kind of word people didn't use lightly, because they knew how quickly nature could revoke whatever supply it had generously offered. Meals weren't rituals of pleasure. They were small victories against the calendar. The northern climate meant that the growing season was brutally short. So short, in fact, that farming felt like a race against a clock controlled by a weather deity with a questionable sense of humour. Planting too early meant frost killed the seeds. Plant too late, and the crops never matured. Even when everything was timed perfectly, the yield depended on the whims of sunshine, rainfall, soil conditions, and the unspoken agreement that no unexpected cold snap would knock everything into failure. Vegetables existed, certainly, but not in the abundant, colourful way you might imagine. Barley and rye were staples, and even these were fragile propositions. A sudden storm, a cold night, or a swarm of pests. Goodbye bread. Turnips and cabbages were reliable enough, but hardly exciting. Vikings learned to appreciate foods that modern people would consider punishment, and that was just farming. Hunting and fishing were just as temperamental. Yes, the sea could provide fish, but only if the weather held, the catch was good, and you didn't lose your gear, your boat, or your fingers to frostbite. Rivers and lakes might offer trout, perch, or pike, but only when they weren't frozen solid or running dangerously fast. Hunting depended on animal populations, migration patterns, and sheer luck. A single missed shot could mean a week of poorer meals. Livestock helped, but slowly. Cows produced milk, when they weren't cold stressed, or already struggling to survive. Goats were hardy, but they didn't exactly produce feasts. Chickens? Eggs were precious, but chickens themselves required feed, protection, and the occasional miracle. Pigs grew well but demanded resources, and slaughtering an animal wasn't a casual decision, it was a risk calculation. Kill too early and you starved later. Kill too late and you might starve now. Every household had a storage system, sometimes grand, sometimes improvised. Drying racks, smoke houses, buried pits, fermentation jars. Preservation wasn't a culinary hobby. It was a survival necessity. Meat was smoked until it resembled edible driftwood. Fish was dried to the texture of reinforced leather. Grains were guarded like treasure. And still, no matter how much was stored, people worried. Because everyone knew hunger was not an event. It was a season. Late winter and early spring were notorious. The preserved food was nearing depletion, the new food wasn't ready, and the land offered little more than moral support. Meals became thinner, smaller, and more experimental. Soups were stretched with water, herbs, or whatever was found under the snow that didn't fight back when picked. Bread portions shrank. People avoided heavy labour not because they were lazy, but because calories were precious and bodies were already running at a deficit. Children felt hunger sharply. Their needs were constant, their stomachs loud, their patience non-existent. Parents stretched rations creatively, offering stories when they couldn't offer seconds. Elders sometimes volunteered to eat less so the young could eat more. A quiet act of sacrifice rarely spoken aloud but deeply understood. And always, underneath everything, lay the awareness that nature alone dictated abundance. Humans could plan, hope, harvest, hunt, store, ration, and pray, but ultimate control belonged to the land. If nature decided to be generous, bellies filled. If nature decided to be cruel, hunger tightened its grip. This relationship with hunger shaped Viking culture profoundly. Hospitality wasn't merely kindness, it was survival solidarity. Sharing food meant sharing life. Feasts were not everyday luxuries. They were extraordinary moments when the community temporarily defeated scarcity. Every celebration featuring meat and ale carried the electric joy of rebellion against the universe's default setting, lack. It also shaped their mythology. Norse cosmology is filled with giants who eat whole animals, gods who feast endlessly, halls overflowing with food, fantasies born from a world where such abundance simply didn't exist. The afterlife was imagined as a place where hunger didn't haunt you, because hunger had defined life too thoroughly to be absent from spiritual dreams. Even raiding, often romanticized as pure aggression, had practical roots. Raids provided access to grain, livestock, and preserved foods that Scandinavia couldn't reliably produce. Taking from others wasn't just greed, it was insurance. And so, hunger was the quiet predator that never needed claws or teeth. It stalked every winter. It lurked behind every failed crop. It punctuated every long night. It made meals precious, food sacred, and survival an ongoing negotiation. Meals were seasonal rumours. The good news? Some days the rumour came true. The bad news? The rest of the year, hunger kept the receipts. If hunger was a familiar companion in Viking-Age Scandinavia, famine was the uninvited relative who kicked in the door, ate everything in the house, and then asked what you were planning to serve for dessert. Famine did not negotiate. It did not signal its arrival with omens or polite notices. One year might be challenging but survivable, and the next year the land simply decided, without explanation or apology, that food production was over. Famine wasn't merely not enough food, it was the collapse of the entire agreement between humans and the earth. One season of failed crops could destabilize a community for years. A second season could empty entire valleys of their population. And a third season. That meant the sagas would remember you, but not in ways you would have appreciated. The roots of famine lay in unpredictable harvests. Viking farmers did everything they could. Ploughing, sowing, weeding, praying, hoping. But nature was the only one who got a vote. A too cold spring might stunt growth. A wet summer could rot grain in the fields. A dry season turned soil into dust. A storm at the wrong moment could flatten an entire crop overnight. And frost. Frost could arrive early, late, or whenever it felt like disrupting the fragile human timeline. Imagine walking into the fields in late August, expecting ripening grain, only to see shriveled stalks barely reaching your knee, or pulling turnips from the ground and finding them hollow, riddled with rot, or returning to a barley plot after a week of hard rain to discover it matted into a swampy mess. It wasn't disappointment, it was dread. Because when the harvest failed, people didn't ask, "How will we thrive?" They asked, "How many of us will make it through winter?" Famine years rippled outward, affecting everything in their path. First went the grain stores, then went the livestock feed. Livestock weakened, milk dried up, animals died or were slaughtered early, providing a temporary increase in meat but a long-term decrease in resilience. Tools broke and couldn't be replaced. Clothing wore thin. People grew quiet, not out of stoicism, but because talking took energy. And then the substitutions began. Bread stretched with bark, moss, or ground-up weeds. Soups flavoured by anything that wasn't toxic. People boiled leather straps to soften them. Some ate fish bones ground into coarse flour. Others chewed on seaweed, bitter roots, or lichen normally reserved for reindeer. Meals weren't meals, they were survival experiments, and not all of them were successful. Communities reacted differently. Some tightened their bonds, sharing what little they had. Others fractured. Families with slightly better stores became protective, suspicious, withdrawn. Theft became both a sin and a strategy. A missing sack of grain could ignite feuds that lasted generations. The line between desperate and dangerous blurred quickly. And famine didn't just affect bodies. Its psychological toll carved deep into the mind. There was the constant calculation: how much food to eat now versus how much to save for a future that looked increasingly bleak. Parents tried to shield children from the worst realities, but children noticed when adults whispered more and chewed less. Elders sometimes volunteered to go without, their silence more eloquent than any speech. Travel increased during famine years, not because people wanted adventure, but because necessity pushed them outward. Some families migrated to relatives in distant settlements. Others ventured to trading posts, hoping to barter whatever they had left. Some took to the sea in search of better luck abroad, and some never returned, becoming another name in the long list of lost during the bad years. Famine also reshaped spiritual beliefs. When nature abruptly withdrew sustenance, people asked why. Had the gods been offended? Had someone broken a taboo? Was this a punishment, a test, or simply the indifference of a world that operated on a scale far beyond human concerns? Rituals intensified, offerings increased, communities performed ceremonies to reawaken the land's generosity, some solemn, others tinged with desperation. Yet famine did not care. Famine never cared. Even when the next year's conditions improved, famine left scars. Survivors emerged thinner, weaker, and altered. Fields needed replanting, herds needed rebuilding, tools needed repairing. Children needed food to grow. It took years, sometimes decades, to recover fully. And just as recovery began, another bad harvest could send everyone spiralling again. But famine also taught lessons, bitter though they were. Vikings learned to diversify fields, rotate crops, store seeds in multiple hidden places, and build networks of exchange with neighbouring settlements. These measures didn't prevent famine, but they occasionally softened its edges. Still, nature held the final authority. The land giveth, and the land removeth, often without explanation. Vikings respected that power because they lived too close to the brink to ever forget it. So yes, nature did not warn you. It simply stopped feeding you. The good news: some years blessed you with abundance, enough to fill storerooms and bellies. The bad news: famine always waited just off stage, ready to step in when the world least expected it. If there was one thing Viking-Age Scandinavians feared losing more than food, more than tools, even more than their sense of direction, it was fire was not a luxury. Fire was not atmospheric mood lighting. Fire was the thin, flickering line between surviving the night and becoming an educational cautionary tale. In a world where the cold stalked you, darkness disoriented you, and predators evaluated you, fire was the only ally that didn't judge your life choices. Inside every longhouse, fire was the beating heart. The hearth sat in the centre, not because it was symbolic, but because every person, animal, and object in the building orbited around it like desperate planets around a warm sun. Without that central flame, the longhouse was simply a box full of cold air and increasingly concerned people. The fire provided heat, but that was only the beginning. Fire dried clothing soaked from storms, thawed limbs stiff from exposure, cooked food to make it chewable rather than merely aspirational, smoked meat for preservation, boiled water to make it safe, and illuminated the room so people didn't accidentally step on their neighbours. Losing fire wasn't inconvenient. It was catastrophic, and it didn't take much to lose it. A poorly placed log, a gust of wind sneaking through a gap in the wall, a sudden downpour while carrying embers from one house to another, a moment of inattention while everyone assumed someone else was tending the hearth. Fire didn't die loudly. It slipped away quietly like a guest who left the feast early because they remembered they had better things to do. Rekindling it wasn't simple. Vikings didn't have matches, lighters, or that drawer where we keep 50 different fire starting tools because we keep forgetting we already own them. Fire starting required tinder, dry kindling, patience, skill, and a shocking willingness to breathe near sparks until your lungs protested. Flint and steel worked, but only when dry, only when struck correctly, and only when the gods felt generous. During deep winter, the danger multiplied. Everything was damp or frozen. Dry wood was as precious as gold, and good kindling was guarded like treasure. If a house lost its flame during a storm or blizzard, people didn't say, "Let's get it going again." They said, "Who has the courage to step outside and beg fire from the neighbours?" That's right. Fire was a community resource. And no one refused a request for flame because everyone understood the stakes. A family without fire was a family in mortal danger. So people carried embers wrapped in moss, bark, or clay containers, miniature smouldering lifelines. If the embers went out during the trip back, that was an emotional journey no one wanted to repeat. Fire safety was also a balancing act. Too little fire and everyone froze. Too much fire and the longhouse became fire. Roof thatching, dried herbs, wooden beams, woolen blankets. Everything inside a Viking home was flammable, often enthusiastically so. Children were taught fire etiquette before they learned half their chores. Adults slept with one ear open, listening for the faintest crackle of flame behaving badly. But beyond warmth and cooking, fire served a psychological function just as important. It kept fear at bay. Firelight pushed back the dark, revealing faces, shapes, and boundaries. Without it, shadows stretched and merged until the longhouse felt less like a home and more like a cavern where anything could be hiding. Fire told you where the world ended and imagination began. The moment the flame dimmed, silence filled the room like rising water. Animals too depended on fire. Livestock breathed easier in the warmth. Dogs curled near the hearth as if performing instinctual fire worship. Even cats, aloof creatures that pretended not to need anyone, claimed the warm spots without apology. If the fire went out, humans and beasts alike felt the temperature drop in their bones. And travel without fire? Unthinkable. Hunters, traders, and travellers carried fire-starting kits with the same seriousness as weapons. Stopping for the night without a flame was an invitation for the cold to stage a full coup. Even a small fire meant hope. Without it, the night pressed in with the confidence of something that had never lost a battle. The fear of losing fire also shaped social rhythms. People rose early to feed the hearth. They rationed wood carefully. They talked, worked, and rested in accordance with the flame's behaviour. If the fire was strong, spirits lifted. If it was weak, conversation dimmed. If it hissed suspiciously, everyone turned to stare at it with the collective anxiety of parents listening for a baby's breathing. Fire even wove itself into mythology. Surtur, the fire giant destined to bring the end of the world, wasn't feared because fire was unknown. He was feared because fire was known too well. It was powerful, unpredictable, life-giving and life-ending. People didn't worship fire, but they respected it with the seriousness of someone handling a temperamental deity in physical form. So yes, fire wasn't comfort. It was life support. The good news? If your hearth burned strong, you lived to see another day. The bad news? A single mistake could extinguish it, and in Scandinavia, death didn't need much more of an invitation than that. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, the most terrifying enemies were not wolves, storms, or mountains. Those at least announced themselves. Disease, on the other hand, was the quiet killer, an invisible force that slipped into homes without knocking, settled into bodies without permission, and left devastation in its wake. You couldn't see it, outrun it, or stab it. Illness was nature's way of reminding humans that threats didn't always roar. Sometimes they whispered. And worst of all, Vikings had no idea what disease actually was. They saw symptoms: fever, coughing, swelling, rashes, weakness, but not causes. No bacteria, no viruses, no parasites under microscopes. To them, illness didn't come from microbes, it came from fate, spirits, magic, or divine displeasure. If you got sick, it felt personal, as if the universe had pulled your name from a hat and said, "This one." Every village had someone who just fell ill one day, someone who'd been strong and healthy the week before, someone who went to bed with a small cough and woke up gasping for air, someone who scraped a knee on a rock, laughed it off, and then watched in horror as the wound swelled, darkened, and burned with fever. A tiny cut could be transformed into a death sentence by infection. A cold winter's draught could lay someone flat for weeks. A minor stomach issue from bad food could spiral into dehydration and delirium. There were no hospitals, no trained physicians. The closest thing to medical care was a healer, usually an older woman or a practiced herbalist, armed with plants, poultices, charms, and hopeful instruction from ancestors. These healers did their best, and sometimes their remedies worked. Other times they failed, and nature made its intentions clear. The body was losing, and disease did not fight fair. It attacked the young, the old, the strong, the weak, anyone who happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Outbreaks swept through communities like ghostly armies. A fever that struck one person often struck several. A cough that began in a child sometimes echoed through an entire longhouse by the end of the week. With families living in close quarters, sharing fire, bedding, tools, food, it spread quickly, efficiently, cruelly. Illness also arrived through trade routes. Every ship returning from abroad carried not only goods but the risk of foreign sicknesses. A merchant's exciting new fabrics from the south might come with a disease no one had immunity to. A raiding party might bring home treasure, and a fever picked up in some distant coastal village. You could fend off enemies on the battlefield, but not the microscopic ones clinging to your comrades' lungs and clothing. And when disease took hold, fear settled in, villagers whispered. Families isolated the sick as best they could. People lay on their beds, stuffed with straw and covered with whatever blankets the household had, shivering or burning with heat, drifting in and out of consciousness while those around them tried to keep hope alive. There were no clean medical tools, no antiseptics, no antibiotics. A wound was cleaned with water, liquor, if available, or herbal mixtures whose effectiveness varied greatly. But infection was relentless. It turned small injuries into swollen, throbbing nightmares. It blackened limbs. It spread through the bloodstream. And sometimes it just ended you. Quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. Pain itself was a warning that something inside the body was going wrong. The Vikings knew pain well. It was part of daily life, but sickness pain was different. It didn't come from labour or combat. It came from something unseen, tightening its grip. If your pain worsened while your strength drained, it meant nature wasn't negotiating. Fevers terrified people, not because they understood what caused them, but because fever transformed the mind. People babbled, hallucinated, screamed, or fell into eerie silence. Fever dreams were described as visions, sometimes prophetic, sometimes terrifying. A burning body was a battlefield where the person and the illness fought, and no one could predict the winner. Coughs were equally dreaded. A harsh cough could come from a simple chill, but could also signal something far worse. Tuberculosis and pneumonia existed, though the Vikings had no words for them. They only knew that sometimes the coughing never stopped. Sometimes it deepened until the chest rattled like a jaw. Sometimes it produced blood, and the person weakened day by day until their body simply surrendered. Stomach illnesses were another quiet horror. Bad food or contaminated water caused cramps, vomiting, and dehydration. With no true understanding of sanitation, it was easy for entire households to become sick at once. Waterborne disease was especially dangerous. After all, Vikings could boil water, but not always, not consistently, and not in the quantities needed to keep everyone safe. And looming behind all of this was the cold. Illness thrived when bodies were already weakened by winter's scarcity or dampness. A person fighting a fever in a drafty longhouse stood on the edge of disaster. If the fire couldn't warm them and their family couldn't feed them, recovery became a miracle. Yet Vikings persisted. They told stories to comfort the sick. They brewed teas to ease symptoms. They prayed. They imagined disease as a force that could be bargained with, appeased, or warded off with charms. They didn't understand illness, but they met it with a form of bravery, showing up every day without knowing whether their own lungs, stomachs, or wounds might betray them next. Because here, illness wasn't an intruder. It was part of life. A constant reminder that even the strongest warrior could be undone by a force too small to see. If you got sick, nature had already decided. The good news, sometimes bodies fought back. The bad news, they didn't always win, and nature never apologized. When night fell in Viking-Age Scandinavia, it didn't merely darken the world, it transformed it. Daylight offered clarity, boundaries, and structure. But night dissolved all of that. Night stretched endlessly. Night swallowed shapes. Night turned everything into questions. And worst of all, night filled the world with sounds. Sounds that didn't bother explaining themselves. Inside the longhouse, the fire flickered, casting shaky shadows against wooden walls. You could see only a small circle of light. Beyond that circle lay a vast expanse of cold, quiet uncertainty. And the Vikings knew one undeniable truth. Night didn't sleep, it listened. It waited for footsteps, breath, fear, and the faintest sign that someone had ventured too close to the edge of its patience. The sounds began subtly. A branch snapping outside, a distant howl carried on the wind, the creak of the longhouse settling, or something pressing gently against the wall. At night, even familiar noises became ominous. The wind stopped being weather and became a whispering messenger. Animals stopped being wildlife and became potential threats. The forest, the mountains, the fields, all the landscapes humans navigated by day, became unrecognizable shapes, hiding everything and revealing nothing. Nighttime fear was a practical emotion. You couldn't see predators, cliffs, holes, or strangers in the dark. And you certainly couldn't identify noises with certainty. The Vikings didn't have lanterns that dispelled darkness with the flip of a switch. They had torches that fought the night like tired warriors with small shields, noble but vastly outmatched. Outside, every noise carried more sharply. Snow amplified sound. Frost stiffened branches until they cracked like breaking bones. The wind rushed around corners, through gaps, and over rooftops, altering pitch in ways that made it sound suspiciously alive. Some nights the wind moaned, shrieked, or growled, tones that made even seasoned adults sit up straighter. And then there were the animals. Wolves howled not just to communicate, but to remind the world they were there. Owls hooted with an unsettling intelligence. Foxes screamed in the night with noises that sounded disturbingly human. Bears, if awake, crashed through brush with a weight that felt too large to belong to any safe creature. Lynx made eerie, almost supernatural yowls. Even rodents contributed to the chaos, skittering under floors or behind walls, sounding larger than they had any right to. But fear wasn't only about predators. Night had a talent for turning harmless things into heart-stopping moments. A wooden beam expanding in the cold sounded like footsteps. A gust of wind slamming a loose shutter sounded like a creature trying to break in. A horse snorting in the barn could jolt a sleeping household upright. Inside the longhouse, darkness layered itself around people. The fire dimmed slowly, embers glowing like tired eyes. People slept in clusters, partly for warmth and partly because everyone secretly preferred not to face the night alone. But sleep didn't always come easily. Not when the world outside sounded unpredictable. Not when the boundary between imagination and reality thinned. For children, nighttime was a realm of monsters. Creatures from stories, spirits from folk tales, shadows that moved differently when watched out of the corner of your eye. Adults, of course, claimed they were above such fears, but they too listened carefully when noises grew too strange. You didn't survive in Scandinavia by dismissing your instincts. If something sounded wrong, it might be. And then there was the silence. Silence was worse than sound. Sound meant the world was still functioning. Silence meant something was waiting. It pressed against the walls, it crowded the fire, it held breaths hostage. Silence turned minutes into long, stretching threads of anticipation. Every Viking knew that sometimes the night was loud, but sometimes it was too quiet. Imagine lying awake, hearing nothing but the faint crackle of cooling wood. You strain your ears, you wait, and then, suddenly, something. A shift, a scrape, a soft thump in the snow. Your heart rate doubles, your breathing slows. Your eyes scan the darkness even though you know you won't see anything past the dying firelight. But you still look. And that was the power of nighttime fear. It invited imagination to take over. In a world without lamps, where shadows reigned and stories filled the gaps of understanding, imagination was not just active, it was weaponized. The mind supplied threats where the eyes could not. Every noise was a possibility. Every possibility was a danger. And every danger felt just outside the door. To cope, Vikings developed nighttime rituals. They banked the fire carefully before sleeping. They barred the doors not only for safety, but because hearing the bar drop felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of control. They placed tools and weapons near their beds, not because they expected an attack every night, but because fearing one was reasonable. Night also shaped their mythology. Creatures like Draugr, trolls and spirits flourished in stories because nighttime felt like the natural habitat for things that lurked between worlds. The Norse didn't invent monsters because they were imaginative. They invented them because night made the world monstrous without much effort. And yet people still slept. They had to. Life demanded energy, but the relationship between Vikings and nighttime was one of wary coexistence. You learned to listen. You learned to ignore what you could. You learned to trust your instincts while trying not to let them control you. Night didn't sleep. It listened. It listened to breath, movement, fear, and the fragile pulse of human life beneath its heavy cloak. The good news, dawn always came eventually. The bad news, night always returned, and it never once promised to be quieter the next time. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, nature didn't feel like a backdrop. It felt like an adversary with strong opinions and an excellent memory. Storms didn't simply happen. They arrived with the dramatic timing of someone trying to ruin your plans. Floods didn't merely rise. They lunged. Sudden freezes didn't just occur. They struck like enemies, choosing the exact moment you were least prepared. Nature wasn't passive, it wasn't neutral. To the Vikings, nature behaved like a thinking enemy, calculating, responsive, and occasionally vindictive. This wasn't superstition born from ignorance. It was the logical reaction to living in a world where natural forces seemed consistently aware of human vulnerabilities. If you repaired your roof, the rain started. If you ventured out to gather supplies, a storm rose up. If you planted your crops with perfect timing, a late frost wandered in like a bored troublemaker. After enough coincidences, even the most practical people began to wonder if the land was messing with them on purpose. Personifying nature became a survival mechanism. It made the unpredictable feel structured. If the wind tore apart a roof in the middle of the night, it wasn't meaningless chaos. It was a force with agency, a reminder to fortify the structure or appease the gods. If a river flooded a settlement, destroying stored food and carefully built shelters, it wasn't random, it was a punishment, a challenge, or a sign. Humans prefer patterns, even in disaster. And nature offered plenty of patterns of misfortune. Take storms. A storm didn't simply pass over your village and move on. No, a storm waited until the fishing boats were out, or the livestock had wandered too far, or the thatched roof was still drying from yesterday's rain. Vikings noticed these moments. They felt targeted. They joked grimly that the sky must have been watching them, deciding when to unleash a tantrum. The sea behaved the same way. A long, calm day lulled sailors into confidence, only for the wind to shift violently once they were too far from shore to return. Waves rose with suspicious timing, as if the ocean wanted to remind sailors who truly commanded the water. In this context, believing the sea had moods wasn't fanciful. It was accurate emotional reporting. Even geological events felt intentional. Landslides, sudden cracks in the earth, rocks tumbling from cliffs. None of these announced themselves politely. They arrived at precisely the wrong moment, startling travellers, damaging longhouses, or wiping out grazing areas. To humans without geological science, these events felt less like physics and more like retaliation. But personification went deeper than danger. Vikings developed stories to explain nature's behaviour. They imagined giants hurling stones during rockfalls. They believed thunder was the result of Thor battling enemies. They saw trickster spirits in whirlpools, frost giants in bitter cold snaps, trolls in eerie rock formations, and land wights in every stretching valley or forest glade. These weren't quaint folk tales. They were attempts to map a chaotic world into something emotionally navigable. If nature acted like a thinking enemy, then perhaps it could also be reasoned with, respected, or placated. Offerings were part of this relationship. Travellers tossed coins or carved runes near waterfalls or lakes to maintain good terms, with the spirits believed to inhabit them. Farmers touched the soil reverently before planting. Hunters whispered thanks to the forest before taking an animal. These acts weren't abstract spirituality. They were negotiations, truces, small gestures meant to keep a temperamental force from turning malicious. Because nature did feel temperamental. Sudden weather changes, unexpected droughts, unpredictable thaws, all these made human planning nearly impossible. People built their entire survival mindset around preparing for ambushes from the environment. You didn't turn your back on nature. You didn't underestimate it. You didn't assume it had exhausted its creativity. And nature did love creativity. Rain didn't simply fall, it arrived sideways. Snow didn't gently coat the world, it dumped enough weight to trap houses and collapse roofs. Wind didn't breeze, it screamed, shoved and rearranged your outdoor belongings. Heat, during brief summers, could arrive in intense royal waves that withered crops before humans even had time to hope for a harvest. Even sunlight was unpredictable, too little in winter, too intense in sudden midsummer bursts. When the environment behaved this erratically, it became nearly impossible to separate coincidence from intent. If your roof collapsed during a windstorm, was it failing craftsmanship, or was the wind showing off? If a beloved fishing spot suddenly dried up, was it a natural shift, or did the spirits withdraw their generosity? If a lightning bolt struck a house, was it random, or a divine message? Vikings lived in the tension between practical reality and mythic interpretation. They chopped wood, built walls, and made tools to survive, but they also whispered about why nature seemed to care so deeply about their downfall. Because at times, it really did feel personal. Nature wasn't merely a set of forces, it was a character in the story of their lives, a character with dramatic instincts. This worldview created caution, humility, and a kind of fierce respect. Instead of trying to dominate nature, Vikings adapted to it. They didn't assume mastery, they assumed negotiation. And that humility, ironically, is one reason they survived as long as they did in such unforgiving environments. So yes, storms and disasters felt intentional. Nature felt like a thinking enemy, always adjusting its strategy. The good news, sometimes nature spared you. The bad news, it never said why and it never guaranteed it would again tomorrow. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, the natural world didn't just influence daily life, it dominated it. Every storm, every freezing wood, every failed hunt or broken bone felt like a message, a warning, or a consequence. Nature behaved so forcefully, so unpredictably, and sometimes so maliciously, that people did what humans always do when faced with the incomprehensible. They assigned it personalities, intentions, tempers, politics. In short, they filled the world with gods, not because they were spiritually greedy, but because life demanded explanations. If the mountains looked like sleeping giants, it made sense to assume giants actually lived there. If thunder cracked open the sky like a war drum, clearly someone divine was swinging a hammer. If the sea swallowed a ship whole, it wasn't bad luck, it was a deity making a point. And if the sun decided to disappear for months at a time, well, that was practically an invitation for myth-making. The Norse pantheon wasn't a peaceful collection of celestial beings lounging in cloud palaces. It was a team of specialists. Storm gods, wind gods, fertility gods, sea gods, death gods, each responsible for a slice of nature that terrified, sustained, or confused human beings. These gods existed because danger existed. When the world feels like it's actively trying to unalive you, it's only logical to assume something powerful is behind it. Take Thor, for example. The man wasn't just popular because he carried a hammer, though that certainly helped. He was beloved because he represented protection in a world that rarely offered any. When thunder rumbled across the sky, Vikings didn't think, "Ah yes, atmospheric conditions." They thought, Thor's out there fighting something, and hopefully it's not us. Thunderstorms felt less random and more like battle announcements. The idea that Thor was smashing giants in the clouds helped people sleep at night, because if someone had to be smashing things, better a god than an aimless weather pattern. Then there was Njord, the sea god. When the North Sea behaved, people thanked him. When it tried to kill them, which was often, they assumed he was displeased. And honestly, who could blame him? Humans kept rowing directly into his domain, poking around in boats held together by hope and wood. The sea's unpredictability needed a face, and Njord was that face. Calm sometimes, furious often, and occasionally generous when you least expected it. Freya and Frey, gods of fertility and harvest, were responsible for the delicate miracle of food appearing on land that didn't always feel inclined to produce anything. A good crop was a divine gift, a bad crop was a divine warning. If winter dragged on too long or the ground refused to thaw, people didn't blame soil composition. They wondered who they'd angered. Odin, the All-Father, embodied wisdom, war, poetry, and the kind of cosmic unpredictability that matched the Scandinavian environment perfectly. He wandered the world gathering knowledge, often in alarming ways, which felt appropriate in a place where learning anything required some degree of pain or risk. Odin's complexity mirrored the world, helpful one day, destructive the next, always watching, always judging. But it wasn't just major gods. The Norse spiritual world was crowded. Every forest glade, river bend, mountain slope, and household corner had its own spirits. Landvettir, Huldras, Alfar, dwarves, and countless lesser beings that influenced daily luck. Some protected farms, some misled travellers, some stole items for sport, others simply observed, judging mortals with immortal patience. Living in such a world meant you never truly felt alone, which was equal parts comforting and unsettling. You didn't chop wood without acknowledging the forest spirits. You didn't sail without offering something to the sea. You didn't plant crops without whispering to the land. Even lighting a fire or crossing a threshold had ritual significance. Spiritual etiquette wasn't optional. It was survival strategy. Why so many beliefs? Because danger was everywhere. And when danger comes in dozens of forms, storms, sickness, predators, hunger, ice, darkness, belief develops in dozens of directions. If everything could kill you, everything needed a god. Not because humans loved complexity, but because complexity was already there, baked into the world's relentless indifference. These gods and spirits helped people make sense of chaos. They transformed random misfortune into narratives, intentions, and moral lessons. If a fishing trip failed, maybe Njord wanted a gift. If a child grew ill, perhaps a household spirit was offended. If lightning struck a barn, Thor was sending a message, or fighting something nearby. The stories didn't remove fear, but they arranged it into a system. A terrifying system, sure, but a system nonetheless. This spiritual worldview also formed the backbone of resilience. Belief turned suffering into meaning. It turned disaster into cosmic drama. It turned daily hardship into part of a larger story where humans weren't helpless victims. They were participants in a universe woven with unseen forces. That mindset didn't eliminate danger, but it made danger survivable. Because when the world feels like a thinking enemy, it helps to believe you have allies, powerful ones. So yes, gods were everywhere because danger was everywhere. The good news, every threat had a divine representative you could pray to, bargain with, or respectfully fear. The bad news? The gods themselves were just as unpredictable as the world they ruled, and sometimes their help felt suspiciously like another lesson in humility. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, worship wasn't a matter of blind devotion or gentle hymns. It was a practical relationship, cold, transactional, and shaped by a world that didn't give anything for free. The Vikings didn't pray to their gods because they wanted spiritual warmth. They prayed because they wanted results. When nature acted like a capricious business partner, humans learned to negotiate, and the currency in those negotiations was sacrifice. The environment demanded constant appeasement. You didn't look at a looming storm cloud and think, weather happens. You thought, I should have left a better offering. You didn't see a poor harvest as a stroke of bad luck. You saw it as a failed contract. Maybe you underpaid. Maybe you misunderstood the terms. Maybe the spirits simply raised their rate without warning. And so sacrifices, large and small, became part of the survival toolkit. Offerings weren't just about honouring gods. They were about persuading the universe not to make your life any harder than it already was. A fisherman leaving before dawn tossed a piece of food into the waves, not out of generosity, but because the sea had a proven track record of eating people without remorse. A farmer buried a small carved token, or a bit of grain in the field, hoping Freya would notice and not treat the crops like a personal affront. Travellers left coins or trinkets at waterfalls, mountain passes, or strangely shaped stones because you never knew which natural landmark had a spirit with a short fuse. These acts weren't symbolic. They were negotiations conducted with the seriousness of a treaty. Everything had a cost. Everything had a return, and giving nothing was not an option because the environment was always watching or always evaluating, always prepared to remind you who controlled the terms, and offerings scaled with the problem. If a storm destroyed a boat, you made a larger offering the next time you went fishing. If disease swept through cattle, you slaughtered one, a painful expense, and offered part of it to the gods. If a winter dragged on mercilessly, people gathered for community rituals, piling contributions in front of altars, hoping that the collective bargaining power of the village would sway divine opinion. And sometimes the sacrifices were far greater. Blot rituals, formal sacrificial ceremonies, were the highest form of negotiation. These could include animals, mostly livestock, but in dire situations could escalate to human offerings. The logic was chillingly simple. If nature demanded a price, the community needed to pay it. Payment was not symbolic, It was literal, because in a world where famine, storms, and sickness killed without hesitation, people concluded that the gods must operate on similar principles. A harsh winter, a failed crop, a sudden inexplicable death. Clearly someone or something was displeased. To the modern mind, this seems extreme, but the Viking perspective was shaped by constant proximity to disaster. If giving something valuable, an animal, a prized object, a ritual inscription, meant the difference between survival and ruin, then giving was rational. Sacrifice wasn't driven by fear alone. It was driven by the belief that nature could be reasoned with, that cosmic forces responded to gestures of respect, humility, or desperation. The location of sacrifices also mattered. Sacred groves, stone altars, lakes, and waterfalls all served as negotiation tables between humans and the forces governing their world. Some rituals were performed publicly, strengthening the idea that survival was a shared responsibility. Others were done privately, in the dark, with whispered words and trembling hands. A single offering, placed under a tree root or in the soil, wasn't small. It was the final card in a hand played against the universe. But the emotional weight of sacrifice fell hardest on certain timing. People made offerings before major decisions, before voyages, before hunts, before planting, before childbirth. Any event with even the slightest chance of disaster required divine consultation, just in case fate was lingering nearby in a foul mood. Negotiations shaped behaviour too. If the gods seemed unhappy, people looked inward. Had someone broken a taboo? Neglected a ritual? Spoken disrespectfully? Used the wrong offering type? Spiritual etiquette mattered because someone else's mistake might jeopardize the entire community. In that way, sacrifice also enforced social order, peer pressure backed by supernatural consequences. Not all sacrifices involved tangible goods. Time, labour, songs, carved runes, crafted tools, anything valuable enough to symbolize respect could be offered. Sometimes people simply performed rituals with intense sincerity. Pouring emotion into gestures meant to sway forces far beyond their understanding. These weren't empty ceremonies. They were the closest thing people had to influencing a world that felt otherwise uncontrollable. And yet, despite all the careful offerings, nature didn't always respond kindly. Sometimes storms still shattered boats. Sometimes crops still failed. Sometimes the gods were silent. Negotiation with nature felt like dealing with a powerful, unpredictable partner who occasionally honoured your agreement, but just as often seemed to forget it existed. But that didn't stop anyone. Negotiation only increased, because doing nothing felt like surrender, and surrender in Scandinavia was rarely a wise strategy. So Vikings continued to bargain, to offer, to hope their gestures would tip the balance in their favour. They didn't worship blindly. They negotiated strategically, with the grim understanding that survival depended on maintaining whatever fragile peace existed between humans and the forces ruling the land, sea, and sky. You didn't worship, you negotiated. The good news? Sometimes the gods listened. The bad news? Sometimes they answered in ways that felt expensive. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, travel wasn't a leisurely undertaking. It wasn't a scenic adventure or a refreshing change of pace, it was a bet. A bold, occasionally foolish gamble placed against nature, and the house always favoured nature. Every journey, whether by land or sea, came with a survival clause. You might leave, but returning was a negotiation. Nothing about the landscape made travel straightforward. Every direction was inconvenient. Every route featured obstacles like an amateur architect had designed Scandinavia, while in a particularly chaotic mood. Distance wasn't the issue. The problem was everything between here and there. Let's start with overland travel, which combined the worst traits of exercise, discomfort, and environmental hostility. There were no paved roads, only dirt paths, when you were lucky. Many routes were narrow animal trails, uneven foot tracks, or improvised paths carved out by people desperate enough to try again after their first attempt failed. These trails twisted through forests so dense they muffled sound, through bogs that swallowed boots whole, across rocky slopes where every step felt like testing your ankle's structural integrity. In spring, thawed snow turned trails into mud traps capable of swallowing carts, livestock, and morale. In summer, swarms of insects turned travellers into unwilling buffies. In autumn, rains turned everything slick enough to create a full-body slipping hazard. And winter? Winter simply removed the concept of trail entirely and replaced it with whatever direction you hoped was correct. Rivers blocked movement constantly. You could ford them, but fording meant wading through water so cold it reorganized your internal organs. You could build a raft, but rafts capsized with cheerful unpredictability. Bridges were rare and often primitive, built by people who clearly believed risk added excitement to life. A single storm could wipe out a bridge, turning a 3-day journey into a 7-day detour. And then there were the mountains, which we have already established did not care about human survival. Crossing them meant dealing with steep inclines, unstable rocks, sudden weather changes, deceptive edges, and visibility that could drop from clear to I can't see my own hand in under a minute. Travellers hugging narrow ridges always understood that a misplaced footstep meant becoming part of the scenery in a very permanent way. Travellers carried weapons not just for self-defence, but because they lived in a world where animals, strangers, and the environment all took turns trying to kill them. Wolves watched from the tree line. Moose claimed trails as personal property. Stray bulls behaved like nature's battering rams, and the forest added its own threats. Hidden holes, fallen logs, branches positioned at exactly eye level for maximum inconvenience. Yet despite all this, land travel was still considered safer than sea travel, because sea travel was a collaboration with chaos. Viking ships were brilliantly crafted, flexible hulls, shallow drafts, strong timbers. But even the best ship couldn't prevent the ocean from showing its personality. Shifting currents, unpredicted winds, sudden storms, floating debris, hidden reefs, every nautical element acted like it had a grudge. A voyage that began in calm water could turn into a wrestling match with nature 2 hours later. Waves rose higher than houses, wind tore sails apart, lightning struck disturbingly close, fog swallowed the world until sailors couldn't see the bow of their own ship. The sea loved disorientation. It treated compasses, had they existed, with contempt. Travel by sea was so dangerous that even experienced sailors performed rituals before departing. Offerings to Njord, words to the waves. Silent glances exchanged as if acknowledging the unspoken truth. If we don't return, tell the others we fought bravely. And by fought bravely they meant clung to the side of a longship while shrieking internally. Navigation was done by reading stars, wind, waves, birds. An instinct. Tools, impressive, but easily ruined by cloud cover, fog, storms, or fatigue. One mistake, one miscalculation, and a voyage meant to last a day could stretch into a week. Ships drifted off course, stranded on foreign shores, or vanished entirely. A shipwreck wasn't considered a freak accident. It was one of many predictable outcomes. But perhaps the most taxing part of travel was isolation. Once you departed, you were on your own. There were no inns, no road markers, no ports with snack stands offering smoked fish on a stick. At best, you found a friendly farmstead, willing to offer shelter. At worst, you slept outside listening to animals you couldn't identify, waiting for dawn to clarify which parts of the landscape wanted you dead. Even groups didn't guarantee safety. In fact, larger parties could attract attention, from animals, from bandits, from rival clans. Travelling with numbers made you stronger, but it also made you noticeable. And being noticeable in Viking-Age Scandinavia was not always a strategic advantage. Yet for all these hazards, travel was essential. People needed to trade, visit family, seek alliances, attend assemblies, raid, explore, move livestock, deliver news, and occasionally flee situations that escalated quicker than anticipated. The Vikings travelled not because it was easy, but because staying put was sometimes even harder. Every journey began with preparation, packing food, patching clothing, sharpening weapons, checking weather that lied constantly. Families said goodbye with a mixture of hope and grim realism. Safe travels, they said, but everyone knew what they meant was closer to try not to become a ballad. Because travelling in the Viking world wasn't a casual activity, it was an ordeal, a risk, a dare thrown at the universe. And every mile past your doorstep answered the same question. How much danger can a human endure before calling it quits? Every journey came with a survival clause. The good news? Some trips ended in success, trade, friendships, or glory. The bad news? Many didn't, and nature never once refunded the gamble. If Viking Age travel was a gamble, farming was a full spiritual commitment, the kind where you signed the contract, handed over the pen, and hoped the universe wouldn't laugh at you too loudly. Agriculture in Scandinavia wasn't merely difficult. It was an emotional rollercoaster powered by bad soil, unpredictable skies, short summers, long winters, and a growing season so brief it felt more like a suggestion than an actual season. Farming here required faith, not religious faith, but faith that nature might be slightly less vindictive this year than usual. Imagine staring at your field in early spring. The ground is technically thawed, but only in the way frozen bread is technically thawed when you press on it and think, yes, that part moved a little. You kneel down, test the soil, and say to yourself, this might work. It is the agricultural equivalent of crossing your fingers while blindfolded. The soil itself presented challenges from day one. Much of Scandinavia's farmland was rocky, uneven, and stingy. Generous soil was rare and guarded like treasure. Clearing fields wasn't a one-time chore, it was a recurring battle. Even after removing boulders, smaller stones crept back to the surface every spring, pushed up by frost like the earth was returning your mess with a passive-aggressive note. I believe this belongs to you. Once the soil was cleared and tilled, planting began. Barley and rye were the stars of the show, reliable enough to grow in the north, but only if conditions didn't decide to reenact a dramatic saga. Every seed planted was a statement of hope. Hope that frost wouldn't return like an unwanted guest. Hope that rain would arrive, but not too much, or everything would drown. Hope that sun would warm the land, but not too intensely, or everything would shrivel. Farming was a balancing act performed on a tightrope held up by weather patterns that couldn't be bothered to stay consistent. The Vikings monitored the sky with obsessive precision. Clouds were analysed. Winds were interpreted. Bird behaviour was decoded like messages from the gods. But despite all this vigilance, the weather often behaved like a mischievous child. Warm one week, cold the next, dry for a month, then suddenly raining every day, till your fields resembled a swamp making career advancements. And when the crops did sprout, the anxiety only increased. Tiny green shoots were not signs of success. They were promises that might be broken at any moment. A late frost could appear overnight and ruin everything. Heavy rains could flatten barley. Sudden heat could stunt growth. Fields required constant attention. Weeding, checking, adjusting, whispering at them like, please, please, because at this point talking to plants felt surprisingly rational. Livestock also played essential roles, though they brought their own quirks. Cows and goats grazed near fields, sometimes too near. Sheep wandered with impressive disregard for boundaries. Pigs rooted in soil you had carefully prepared, undoing hours of labour in minutes, because pork had no respect for agricultural planning. Animals provided fertiliser, milk and labour, but they also demanded food, quite a lot of it. Feeding them in winter depended entirely on how successful your hay harvest had been. A bad hay season meant watching cows contemplate existential despair by January. Harvest season, the most important time of year, was a frantic, exhausting, all-hands-on-deck marathon. When the barley ripened, it had to be cut now, not when we feel like it. Every day of delay increased the risk of rain flattening it or wind scattering it. Families worked from sunrise to sunset, sick or not, tired or not, hungry or not, The stakes were too high for excuses. Then came the drying, threshing, and storing. Each step a delicate operation that could ruin months of work if mishandled. Grain had to be perfectly dried or it would mould. Storage pits had to be sealed tight or animals, insects, or dampness would destroy everything. The anxiety didn't end at harvest. It simply changed shape, becoming a new fear. What if the food doesn't last? Because even if the harvest was good, nothing was guaranteed. A rodent infestation could reduce grain bins to sad piles of dust. A flood could ruin storage. A neighbour's house fire could leap to your own. And the most painful truth of all, even a great year in Scandinavia might still be only adequate in regions farther south. The margin for error was microscopic. Farming wasn't just physical labour, it was emotional labour. Every decision carried consequences. Plant too early and frost punished you. Plant too late and the crops never matured. Work the soil too hard and you weakened it. Work it too little and weeds declared victory. The entire year revolved around the land and the land rarely cooperated. Yet the Vikings persevered. They developed efficient tools, experimented with crop rotation, shared knowledge across generations, and used every scrap of available land with breathtaking creativity. They built terraces. They fertilized with seaweed. They farmed slopes, valleys, and tiny strips of soil between rocks. Farming wasn't simply an occupation. It was a yearly prayer spoken with calloused hands. And that's why harvest celebrations were so emotional. When people feasted, sang, and toasted the gods, they weren't celebrating abundance. They were celebrating survival. They were celebrating that nature hadn't ruined them this year. They were celebrating the end of months of uncertainty. You planted hope and harvested anxiety. The good news? Sometimes the earth gave you enough to live. The bad news? It never promised to do so again. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, survival wasn't a universal right. It was an audition. The environment didn't welcome you, nurture you, or even tolerate you unless you proved yourself useful, adaptable, and unreasonably persistent. The land did not care about fairness, intention, or emotional resilience. It cared only about outcomes. And if you weren't strong enough, fast enough, resourceful enough, or the land quietly removed you from the population chart. Nature, in effect, ran its own recruitment program, and the acceptance rate was notoriously low. This harsh filtering created a society where strength wasn't optional. But strength didn't mean brute force alone. It meant durability, cleverness, community cooperation, mental grit, and the ability to adapt faster than nature could invent new problems. Vikings weren't forged by battle alone. They were forged by everything their environment threw at them long before they picked up a sword. Start with childhood, the first test. Infancy was perilous. Cold alone could claim a newborn in hours. Illnesses struck without mercy. Food scarcity meant children didn't simply grow. They survived nutritional gaps by sheer biological stubbornness. Even reaching age 5 was considered an achievement. Children who lived learned early how the world worked. Don't wander from home, don't underestimate nature, and don't assume tomorrow will resemble today. Those lessons weren't philosophical, they were practical tools for survival. By adolescence, nature's expectations increased. Young people contributed fully to labour, tending livestock, hauling water, gathering wood, repairing fences, helping in fields, preparing food, and navigating terrain that seemed purposely designed to test joints and sanity. Winters toughened bones, summers hardened muscles. Every season demanded new skills. Nature didn't care how young you were. If you lived here, you worked here. Adults faced a relentless series of challenges. A Viking adult's strength wasn't measured only by combat ability. It was measured by how well they handled constant danger. Could they build a roof sturdy enough to survive storms? Could they navigate fjords without drowning? Could they ration food during prolonged winters? Could they track game without becoming prey? Each answer determined whether their household endured or faltered. Environmental selection wasn't just physical, it shaped mindset. only people capable of strategic thinking lasted. Winter approached with the accuracy of a debt collector, so planning wasn't optional. A careless decision in summer meant hunger in winter. A poorly built boat meant a vanished crew. A badly timed journey meant an obituary. People learned to predict danger, avoid unnecessary risks, and prepare obsessively. The culture of the Vikings, often caricatured as reckless and aggressive, was in reality the opposite. It was calculated, cautious, systematic. Because recklessness was punished instantly by the land, courage existed, but it was tempered by respect for forces far more powerful than any warrior. Communities were shaped by this selection process as well. Living alone was nearly impossible. Humans needed each other to survive the environment's cruelty. Families combined strengths, neighbours shared resources, labour and protection. Children were cared for collectively. Elders provided wisdom that could prevent catastrophic mistakes. Community wasn't a sentimental concept, it was survival architecture. But this didn't mean life was uniformly equal. Nature rewarded skills and punished weaknesses, and so did society. Hunters who could feed the village earned deep respect. Carpenters who built warm, durable houses were essential. Women who managed food storage or mastered herbal knowledge held life-saving authority. Leadership wasn't founded on rhetoric, it was founded on competence. You couldn't bluff your way through a Scandinavian winter. The environment also selected for resilience of spirit. The Vikings lived with the constant possibility of loss, of loved ones, of livestock, of crops, of homes. Trauma wasn't rare. It was stitched into the rhythm of existence. People learned to grieve while moving forward, because stopping meant freezing, starving, or falling behind in a world that tolerated no pauses. This relentless natural filtering can be seen in their mythology as well. Norse stories didn't promise gentle gods or peaceful afterlives. Their gods struggled, failed, fought, lost eyes, hung themselves from trees, or awaited a foretold apocalypse. These weren't tales of comfort, they were tales of endurance. If even gods had to fight endlessly against fate, humans couldn't expect anything less. That mindset, unyielding, stoic, practical, emerged directly from the land's demands. A softer environment might have produced a softer culture, but in Scandinavia, softness was a trait that rarely survived long enough to become tradition. Travellers who entered Viking lands without understanding this relationship often felt bewildered by the starkness of daily life. Why work so hard? Why prepare so obsessively? Why always assume something could go wrong? Because something could go wrong, frequently and spectacularly. Nature didn't merely test people, it filtered them aggressively. The ones who survived built the customs, beliefs, and values we now associate with Viking culture. Strength wasn't glorified because it was glamorous. It was glorified because it was necessary. So yes, nature decided who was strong enough to live here. The good news, if you endured, you earned a place in a culture built on resilience. The bad news, the land reserved the right to test you again tomorrow with new creative methods. In Viking-Age Scandinavia, fear was not an embarrassing emotion to hide. It was a tool, a warning system, a finely tuned internal compass that kept people alive in a world where the margin between survival and disaster could be measured in breaths. The environment did not reward bravery for bravery's sake. It rewarded awareness, humility, the ability to recognize danger early and often. In the North, fear didn't mean weakness. It meant you were paying attention. Arrogance, by contrast, tended to die quickly. A person who approached a frozen river with swagger instead of caution, who boasted loudly before testing the ice, who assumed nature would step aside out of respect. These were the people memorialized in sad stories and quiet cautionary tales. Not because the community mocked them, but because the land punished them. Nature had no patience for overconfidence. It didn't care how strong you were, how respected you were, or how many battles you'd won. A single miscalculation, a single overlooked warning sign, and the environment reminded you who held the real power. Fear was never viewed as cowardice. It was understood as a form of intelligence. If your stomach tightened before a journey, It meant you were evaluating the weather with a seriousness the weather deserved. If you hesitated before entering a dark forest, you were acknowledging the predators, cliffs, and hidden dangers waiting inside. If you paused at the shoreline as the wind shifted, instinctively sensing an approaching storm, that wasn't timidity, it were wisdom. Children were taught early that fear kept people alive. They learned to listen to the sounds of the forest, to note the tone of the wind, to distinguish the crack of safe, thick ice from the sinister snap of thin ice. They learned the silence before a storm, the smell of the air before rain, the behaviour of animals before a seasonal shift. Awareness wasn't a skill, it was a birthright, a cultural inheritance more valuable than any weapon. Adults reinforced this mindset through everyday practice. Hunters moved with caution, always scanning for tracks, wind direction, and signs of animals behaving strangely. Sailors read the sea with reverence, never assuming calm waters meant safety. Farmers watched the sky obsessively, attuned to the smallest changes that might threaten crops. Travellers prepared obsessively, carrying tools, food, and backup plans because fear reminded them that nothing was guaranteed. Fear made people double-check their knots, reinforce their longhouse walls, mend their boots before they tore, and gather extra firewood even when they felt confident they had enough. Fear was why they waited an extra day if the weather seemed off, even if no one could articulate exactly what felt wrong. Fear made them prepare for possibilities that optimism overlooked. This caution created a quiet culture of respect for the environment, for tradition, for the knowledge of elders, for instincts that had been honed through generations of harsh experience. When an older person said, "The wind doesn't sound right today," no one rolled their eyes, everyone listened. They listened because fear told them that the cost of being wrong was far greater than the cost of being careful. Ironically, this respect produced the opposite of fragility. It produced resilience. People who acknowledged danger adapted better than those who tried to deny it. Fear helped Vikings develop sophisticated skills, reading landscapes, navigating oceans, building sturdy structures, planning for winter, storing food, crafting tools, and responding quickly to emergencies. Fear made them strategic thinkers long before strategy became a formal concept, because Scandinavia demanded strategy. You couldn't simply charge into a fjord, a forest, or a mountain and assume strength would carry you through. Strength without awareness was simply an invitation for disaster. Fear even shaped social behaviour. When someone didn't return from a journey on time, the village didn't assume laziness. They assumed trouble. Search parties set out immediately, not because they panicked easily, but because fear made them proactive. When someone fell ill, the community rallied, not out of pity, but because they knew danger escalated quickly if ignored. Fear taught them to help each other before crises worsened. The mythology reflected this cultural truth. Norse gods weren't fearless heroes. They were beings constantly preparing for disaster. Odin sought wisdom because he feared what he didn't know. Thor battled giants because he feared what unchecked forces might do to the world. Even the saga of Ragnarok, the end of days, was a reminder that awareness of danger didn't weaken you. It strengthened your readiness. Fear wasn't shameful. It was an advisor. Not the kind that whispered doubt into your ear, but the kind that slapped you on the shoulder and said, "Pay attention, this might matter." It taught people to respect what they couldn't control, to plan for outcomes they didn't prefer, and to walk through the world with open eyes instead of reckless bravado. Arrogance, on the other hand, was treated like a fatal flaw. A hunter who bragged that wolves would never approach him was precisely the hunter who learned too late that wolves did not care about human ego. A sailor who declared he could handle any weather was usually the one swallowed by a storm. A farmer who planted recklessly because this year feels lucky became the example villagers referenced in whispers a decade later. The land filtered people, yes, but it also educated those it spared. Fear didn't mean weakness. It meant awareness, respect, readiness. It meant you understood your environment well enough to see the threats woven into its beauty. Arrogance died quickly up north. The good news, fear kept you alive. The bad news, you needed it every single day. If you lived in Viking-Age Scandinavia, the idea of taming nature would have sounded like the setup to a joke. Not a good joke either. More like the kind people repeat awkwardly because they're not sure if they're supposed to laugh or feel concerned. In the North, nature wasn't something you controlled. It wasn't something you mastered. It wasn't something you bent to your will. It was something you endured, negotiated with, avoided when necessary, and respected every single day. Control was unrealistic, endurance wasn't. Unlike civilizations in gentler climates, the Vikings didn't build complex irrigation systems, grand temples to reorder the seasons, vast terraced farmlands, or monumental stone structures meant to reshape the landscape. They didn't try to bend mountains into highways, force rivers into new routes, or clear entire forests into obedient farmland. Why? Because nature in Scandinavia never gave the slightest hint that it was open to feedback. The land was rocky, stubborn, sculpted by glaciers, and filled with terrain that looked like it had been designed by a committee of giants who each had different opinions about what walkable meant. Mountains jutted without symmetry, fjords carved deep knife-like wounds into the coastline, forests twisted into endless shifting labyrinths, rivers raced like they were late for something. Everything was magnificent, but nothing was compliant. Trying to dominate such a landscape would have been like trying to teach etiquette to a thunderstorm. Instead, the Vikings adapted. They learned when nature allowed habitation, when resources could be gathered, how to move through environments that didn't want them, and why fighting the land directly was a losing strategy. Their settlements were small, flexible, and built to blend into their surroundings rather than impose upon them. Houses were low against the wind, roofed with turf to insulate and camouflage. Villages nestled in coastal pockets, sheltered valleys, or river bends where the terrain offered minimal hostility. Even large structures, like longhouses or communal halls, were crafted with materials the land willingly provided, not those it resisted giving up. Vikings didn't argue with nature. They cooperated with what it allowed. This mindset extended to farming as well. They didn't try to force the land to produce what it didn't want to grow. Instead, they grew hardy grains that could tolerate cold. They raised animals that could survive thin grazing and brutal winters. Their fields were carved in pockets of soil where the land grudgingly permitted agriculture. They worked with what existed, not against it. And to be clear, this wasn't defeatism. It was strategy. Domination required predictability. Scandinavian nature offered none. You couldn't count on the sky. You couldn't predict the wind. You couldn't depend on even a single season behaving the way it did the previous year. To tame something implies you understand its patterns, but the North didn't have patterns, it had moods. Viking craftsmanship reflected this philosophy. Boats weren't designed to conquer the sea, they were designed to survive it. Flexible hulls let ships ride waves rather than plough through them. Light frames allowed easy beaching and fast escape from violent weather. Their vessels cooperated with water instead of trying to crush it into obedience. Likewise, travel routes didn't challenge the terrain, they simply followed its most forgiving lines. Traders and raiders hugged coastlines, slipped through fjords, and used natural harbours rather than forcing new paths. Overland routes wound around obstacles, not through them. Efficiency was less important than safety, because shortcuts in Scandinavia often became long, tragic lessons about hubris. Even spiritually, the Vikings didn't imagine their gods as beings who dominated nature. Thor didn't stop storms. He was storms. Njord didn't command the sea to be calm. He simply represented it. Freyr didn't override the seasons. He moved within them. The divine was woven into natural forces, not above them. You didn't ask a god to cancel winter. You asked for the strength to get through it. This worldview also shaped leadership. A chieftain who promised to conquer the environment would have been politely escorted out of the longhouse for being dangerously out of touch. Good leaders promised endurance strategies, better storage, Stronger roofs, safer travel, smarter resource use. The strongest Viking wasn't the one who stood defiant against nature. It was the one who prepared best, adapted quickest, and understood when to yield. Because yielding wasn't weakness, it was survival. Nature wasn't the enemy. It wasn't an ally either. It was a force, a vast, untamable, unpredictable force with which you negotiated your existence daily. Attempting to dominate it would have been suicidal. Adapting to it, however, produced a culture capable of thriving in one of the harshest environments in Europe, and that's the real core of Viking resilience. They learned to move with the land, not against it. They shaped their homes, tools, schedules, and expectations around what the environment permitted. They saved their battles for things they could influence: trade, travel, warfare, politics, community. Not for the sky, the sea, or the seasons. Control was unrealistic. Endurance wasn't. The good news: adapting made them resourceful, tough, and brilliantly flexible. The bad news: nature still held every advantage, and it never once agreed to make the game easier. By the time you've lived a full day in Viking-Age Scandinavia, just a single day, you understand something profound. Fear wasn't a flaw in this world. Fear was logic. Fear was realism. Fear was your most reliable survival tool. Everything in the north, from the weather to the wildlife to the terrain itself, demanded respect, caution, and the humility to recognize that you were a small creature living inside a very large, very moody system. Looking back on everything the Vikings faced: cold, hunger, storms, predators, sickness, dangerous travel routes, unpredictable seasons, and a landscape that seemed to test human resilience for sport, it becomes clear that fear wasn't a burden they carried. It was a companion that whispered, "Pay attention," because paying attention kept you alive. The environment of Scandinavia didn't operate like an enemy that could be defeated, or a puzzle that could be solved. It was more like an ongoing examination administered by a teacher who didn't believe in answer keys. Each day brought new conditions, new risks, and new chances for disaster. You didn't survive because you were the strongest. You survived because you read the signs, listened to your instincts, respected the land's limits, and, most importantly, never assumed you had won. The Vikings didn't see the world as safe, stable, or predictable. They saw it as alive, a force that acted according to its own rules. This worldview didn't make them paranoid. It made them prepared. It made them observant. It made them masters of adaptation rather than fools of arrogance. Living with such awareness shaped everything: work, worship, architecture, travel, agriculture, community. A longhouse wasn't just a shelter. It was a carefully engineered negotiation with the cold. A fishing boat wasn't just a vessel. It was a floating prayer that the sea wouldn't change its mind while you were still on it. A storage pit wasn't simply food storage. It was the physical manifestation of hope measured against the reality of winter. Fear taught people to plan their days around cycles they couldn't control. To store food not because they were greedy, but because scarcity was practically guaranteed at some point. To treat fire like a sacred ally, because without it, warmth and light were luxuries the night could steal instantly. To build communities that pooled resources, shared risks, and turned collective caution into collective strength. Fear also shaped philosophy. Norse mythology didn't promise triumph, it promised struggle. Even the gods faced threats they couldn't fully conquer. Even Odin, the wisest, spent his life trying to gather more knowledge because he feared what he didn't know. Even Thor, the strongest, fought storms and giants relentlessly, not because he expected to end danger, but because danger never ended. Ragnarok wasn't a story of choking hope. It was a story of eternal readiness. And that attitude wasn't pessimistic. It was honest. In a world defined by uncertainty, the Vikings built a culture that thrived precisely because it refused to underestimate forces larger than itself. They didn't romanticize hardship, they accepted it. They didn't imagine domination, they practiced coexistence. They didn't believe safety was guaranteed, they believed survival was earned, one decision at a time. This mindset also created something unexpected, a fierce kind of resilience. Not the motivational poster bond, but the real kind. The gritty, unglamorous kind that lets you wake up every morning knowing the world may try to kill you again, but choosing to get up anyway. Because here's the truth. Living in Viking-Age Scandinavia wasn't about defeating nature. It was about enduring it. And endurance was a quiet, steady triumph. Every day you kept your fire burning, kept the ice from breaking under you, kept sickness at bay, kept predators at a distance, kept hunger in check, kept storms from sweeping you away. That was victory. Small victories, accumulated daily, became the backbone of Viking life. So when night fell and the longhouse dimmed, people didn't congratulate themselves on conquering the world. They nodded to each other with the kind of tired pride that comes from surviving another round in a fight no one ever truly wins. Because nature didn't tire, nature didn't rest, nature didn't lose interest. But humans learned to adapt, endure, and continue, knowing full well that survival was never final. And that's the logic at the heart of this entire story. The good news, you survive today. The bad news, nature tries again tomorrow.